My husband stood in the chaotic emergency room holding the surgical consent forms that could save my life. I watched through blood-blurred vision as he crossed out my name, wrote his childhood friend's name, and screamed at doctors to save her instead. He left me bleeding on a gurney to chase her stretcher. He had no idea that 10 minutes before our car slammed into that concrete barrier, I had seen the text message that proved he was stealing my life. My name is Cassidy, and I am 28 years old. I work as a forensic auditor for a corporate firm, which means my career is built on finding the truth hidden inside complex lies. Before I share how I turned my shattered heart into the ultimate weapon, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had your loyalty repaid with absolute betrayal. The harsh fluorescent lights assaulted my eyes as consciousness crashed back. The sterile smell of antiseptic mixed with the metallic scent of my blood. I lay flat on a hard plastic gurney. Every breath felt like jagged glass piercing my lungs. A fractured rib was pressing dangerously close to my vital organs. My head throbbed and warm liquid trickled down my face, matting my hair against my temple. The noise around me was deafening. Medical monitors beeped frantically, indicating dropping vital signs. Nurses shouted codes and urgent commands. Heavy trolley wheels skidded violently against the polished floor. I tried to speak to call out for help, but my throat was dry and all that escaped was a weak gasp. I turned my head slightly, fighting through a crushing wave of nausea to scan the trauma room. Through the dizzying blur of moving scrubs, I finally saw him. Nolan, my husband of 4 years. He stood near a nursing station, appearing perfectly unharmed, save for a torn sleeve on his expensive suit. A massive wave of relief washed over my broken body. He was safe. He was alive. I tried to lift my hand to wave to him to let him know I was awake and desperately needed his comfort. I expected him to rush to my side to hold my hand and tell me everything was going to be fine. But his broad back was turned completely toward me. He was screaming at a tall emergency room doctor, his face red with a desperate kind of panic I had never seen from him before. He was not looking for me at all. A nurse rushed up to Nolan holding a heavy clipboard filled with documents. I strained to listen over the ringing in my ears. The doctor tried explaining triage protocols, telling Nolan they needed immediate consent for emergency surgical interventions for both victims of the crash. Nolan snatched the clipboard from the nurse with violent force. He did not ask about my condition. He did not ask if his wife was surviving the trauma. He pointed a shaking finger down the hall toward a curtained bay, where Sienna, his childhood friend who was riding in the back seat of our car, was being treated. "Save Sienna first," he roared, his voice echoing over the clamor. "She is weaker. You have to save her right now." The attending doctor tried to intervene, pointing toward my gurney, explaining clearly that my vitals were dropping rapidly, and I had severe internal injuries that required immediate surgical attention. Nolan did not even cast a single glance in my direction. "Cassidy just has scratches," he yelled, pushing the clipboard back into the doctor's chest. "She can wait. Fix Sienna immediately." He hastily scribbled his signature, authorizing them to prioritize the woman he had always claimed was strictly just a platonic friend. Without a single backward glance, he sprinted down the corridor, chasing after Sienna's stretcher, leaving me completely abandoned and bleeding out in the trauma bay. I lay there paralyzed by a deep, freezing coldness that had nothing to do with the physical shock of the accident. My husband had just commanded a medical professional to treat my life as secondary. A trembling young nurse approached my gurney, her eyes filled with deep pity and awkwardness. She held a duplicate clipboard out to me. Her hands were shaking visibly. "I am so terribly sorry," she whispered softly, avoiding direct eye contact. "Since your husband refused, we need you to sign your own surgical consent forms before we can take you up to the operating room." I slowly raised my right hand. My fingers were slick and stained bright red with my blood. I gripped the pen she offered and pressed it firmly against the crisp paper, leaving crimson smears across the dense legal text as I traced my signature. As the ink and my blood dried on the page, my mind was violently pulled backward through time to exactly 10 minutes before the screeching tires and shattering glass changed my reality. We were driving down the interstate returning from a party. The rain came down in heavy sheets, making roads slick. Nolan was driving, his hands gripping the steering wheel tight, his jaw set in a rigid line. Sienna was sitting directly behind him in the back seat, quiet. I was in the front passenger seat, leaning forward to adjust the climate control dial, when Nolan's phone, connected to the vehicle's Apple CarPlay system, suddenly lit up the main dashboard screen. He had forgotten to turn off the message preview feature. A notification flashed in bold letters for only a few fleeting seconds. But my forensic auditor brain captured every single detail instantly. It was a text message from Sienna, the very same woman sitting right behind us, pretending to look out the window. The message read clearly on the bright dashboard display screen. The entire startup funds transferred successfully. Tell her you want a divorce tonight before she finds out what we have done. The memory of that dashboard screen burned into my retinas as the gurney lurched forward. The wheels hit the threshold of the surgical wing with a violent thud. Overhead, fluorescent lights flashed past like strobe lights in a nightmare. Medical staff flanked me on all sides, hooking up intravenous bags and preparing the surgical instruments. The pain in my fractured rib was a blinding white-hot agony, but it paled in comparison to the realization that my entire marriage was a meticulously funded fraud. As a forensic auditor, I spent my career dissecting financial anomalies and tracking hidden assets. I found truth in balance sheets. Now I was lying on a hospital bed, bleeding from the head, realizing that the man I loved had viewed my life purely as a depreciating asset. He had not just betrayed me, he had financed his betrayal with our joint savings and then literally left me to die on a cold highway. Suddenly, the heavy double doors of the surgical ward burst open. A loud crash echoed over the frantic beeping of my heart monitor. A commanding voice cut through the medical jargon, resonating with absolute authority. "Stop moving her right now. Do not push those doors open until I speak to her." I struggled to turn my head through the thick haze of pain. Striding through the chaos was Jada. She wore a perfectly tailored charcoal pantsuit, her heels clicking sharply against the linoleum floor. Jada was married to Leo, my husband's estranged older brother. As a high-powered corporate litigator, she struck fear into boardrooms across the entire city. More importantly, she was a fierce, brilliant African-American woman who had seen through the toxic facade of Nolan's family from day one. She despised my mother-in-law. She despised Nolan. She knew their polished smiles hid rotten intentions, and she had always warned me to keep my guard up. "Ma'am, you cannot be back here," the attending surgeon yelled, stepping directly into her path. "This is a sterile environment, and the patient is crashing rapidly." Jada did not even break her stride. She flashed a heavy brass badge and a laminated legal document that I immediately recognized as a federal evidence preservation order. "I am her designated legal proxy, and I need exactly 1 minute before you put her under," she stated, her tone leaving absolutely no room for debate. "Or I will have this entire hospital tied up in federal litigation until the next century. Give us the room." The medical team hesitated, but the sheer force of her presence made them take a synchronized step back. Jada leaned over the metal side rails of my gurney. Her sharp, dark eyes locked onto mine, piercing through my haze of blood loss. The scent of her expensive perfume briefly masked the overwhelming smell of iodine and copper. She placed a cool, steady hand over my trembling fingers. "Cassidy, listen to me very carefully," she whispered, her voice dropping to a low, intense pitch. "You are an auditor. You rely on hard, undeniable data. I am giving you the data right now." 5 minutes after the police dispatch went out, I pinged the cloud server linked to your vehicle. Nolan thought the local police would simply extract the physical memory card from the dashboard camera, and that would be the end of his problem. He completely forgot that the firm's security protocol automatically uploads telemetry data to a remote encrypted server. I intercepted the entire digital package before the highway patrol even managed to secure the perimeter of the crash site. My breath hitched, causing a fresh stab of agony deep in my chest. I tried to form a question, but Jada shook her head slightly, silencing me. She leaned in closer, her breath warming my cheek. It was not a hydroplaning accident, Cassidy. The data logs are pristine and terrifying. Nolan maintained perfect traction until the exact moment he approached the concrete barrier. At exactly 65 miles per hour, he deliberately jerked the steering wheel 22 degrees to the right. He completely bypassed the front braking system. He used your side of the vehicle as a deliberate crumple zone. He intentionally angled the impact to take the brunt of the brutal force directly on your passenger door while keeping the rear driver's side where Sienna was sitting perfectly shielded from the collision. I stared at her, my mind struggling to process the sheer calculated brutality of her words. He used me as a human shield. Jada squeezed my hand tighter, grounding me in the terrifying reality. It gets worse, she continued, her eyes burning with a fierce protective fury. The impact sensors show he disabled the passenger side early warning system through the master console right before the crash. He manually delayed your airbag deployment by a full 2 seconds. He wanted maximum velocity impact on your side. He mathematically calculated the crash geometry to break your body and save her. This was not a tragic rainy night collision. This was a calculated execution masked as bad weather. The anesthesiologist stepped forward nervously, tapping a syringe against the intravenous line. "Time is up, counselor," he said urgently. "We have to push the propofol right now because her blood pressure is plummeting to dangerous levels." Jada did not move away. She kept her intense gaze locked directly onto my fading eyes. The cold, liquid fire of the anesthesia began to track up my arm, traveling quickly through my veins. The edges of the surgical bay started to turn gray. The frantic sounds of the hospital monitors faded into a dull, distant hum. Jada leaned her face just inches from mine. Her expression was a mask of pure, relentless determination. "You do not get to quit today," she whispered fiercely, her words serving as an iron anchor in the pulling void. "You are going to let these surgeons patch up your broken ribs and stitch up your fractured skull. Do not you dare die on this operating table, Cassidy. We have a war to win, and I need my absolute best auditor alive to tear his entire empire down to the studs." I felt the heavy darkness pulling me under, dragging my consciousness down into the deep anesthetic depths. But the raw fear and the physical agony were suddenly completely gone. They were entirely consumed by something much stronger and far more lethal. A cold, absolute vow of vengeance took root deep inside my soul. Nolan thought he had orchestrated the perfect elimination. He believed he had successfully buried his massive financial theft, his secret affair, and his naive wife in one convenient pile of twisted metal on the highway. He severely underestimated the woman he married and the allies she possessed. As the blackness finally swallowed me whole, a single crystal-clear thought echoed in the silence of my mind. I am going to survive this operating table, and when I wake up, I am going to destroy him. The transition back to consciousness was not a gentle awakening. It was a violent, tearing sensation as my mind clawed its way up through the heavy chemical sludge of surgical anesthesia. The sterile white ceiling tiles of the intensive care unit slowly came into sharp focus. My body felt as though it had been encased in wet concrete. A thick plastic tube scratched against my dry throat, and the rhythmic hissing of a ventilator filled the quiet room. Every breath was a tightly calculated negotiation with the shattered ribs strapped beneath layers of thick medical gauze. I turned my head a fraction of an inch to scan the room. There were no flowers, there were no balloons, there was no devoted husband holding my hand and weeping tears of relief. The vinyl visitor chair in the corner sat completely empty. Nolan was nowhere to be found. My analytical brain immediately began cataloging the data points of my reality. I had survived the surgery. My mind was intact. The dashcam revelation Jada had given me before I went under was not a hallucination. It was hard factual evidence. My husband had tried to kill me to fund a new life with his mistress. Before I could fully process the tactical implications of my survival, the heavy wooden door to my ICU room swung open. The sharp, aggressive click of expensive heels echoed against the linoleum. It was not a doctor or a nurse coming to check my vital signs, it was Patricia. My 58-year-old mother-in-law marched into the room wearing a pristine cashmere coat and carrying a steaming cup of boutique coffee. Her blonde hair was sprayed into an immovable helmet of perfection. She did not approach my bed with the tender concern of a family member. She walked in with the cold entitlement of a landlord inspecting a damaged property. She stopped at the edge of my bed, looking down at my bruised and bandaged face with an expression of undisguised irritation. She did not ask how I was feeling. She did not ask what the surgeons had to repair. Instead, she lifted her opposite arm and carelessly tossed a heavy object directly onto my injured legs. I winced as the weight settled against my shins. It was my purse. The leather was scuffed from the crash, and dark brown spots of my own dried blood stained the designer logo. "I need your banking PIN," Patricia demanded, her voice entirely devoid of any human empathy. I stared up at her, struggling to clear the lingering fog of painkillers from my vocal cords. I opened my mouth to speak, but it was bone dry. "Do not play dumb with me, Cassidy," Patricia snapped, taking a step closer and looming over my bed. "Sienna's insurance won't cover the premium plastic surgeon she needs for her facial scarring. Nolan said you have emergency funds. Give me the PIN." The sheer audacity of the extortion attempt sent a shockwave of cold clarity straight through my nervous system. I was lying in the intensive care unit recovering from a deliberately orchestrated car crash, and my mother-in-law was acting as the debt collector for my husband's mistress. Nolan had sent his own mother to drain my emergency savings to fix the face of the woman he was replacing me with. I shook my head slightly, refusing to speak. Patricia slammed her free hand against the metal bedrail, making the entire frame rattle. "Stop being so incredibly selfish," she hissed, leaning her face aggressively close to mine. "You are the reason we are entirely in this mess to begin with. You brought this entirely on yourself." I frowned, fighting the overwhelming urge to hit the nurse call button. "Do not look at me like that," Patricia sneered, pointing a manicured finger at my chest. "Nolan told me exactly what happened in that car. He told me how you were acting completely hysterical. You were nagging him relentlessly about money and work. You were distracting him while he was trying to navigate through a dangerous rainstorm. Your relentless complaining caused him to lose control of the vehicle. You caused this crash, Cassidy. You nearly killed my son and his dear friend because you cannot control your emotions. The absolute least you can do is pay to fix the damage your nagging caused." The gaslighting was executed with terrifying precision. If I had not spoken to Jada before the surgery, I might have actually believed her. The trauma of a massive head injury can easily create false memories or erase true ones entirely. Nolan was counting on my concussion. He had already planted the seed with his mother, wrapping his calculated attempted manslaughter in the convenient package of a hysterical wife causing an accident. He was building his legal defense while I was unconscious. Patricia pulled a sleek silver pen and a small notepad from her coat pocket. She slapped them down on my tray table. "Write down the access codes, Cassidy. Do not make me ask you again. Nolan needs to take care of Sienna, and you are holding up the process." I looked at the pen and then back up at Patricia. The hatred in her eyes was a living, breathing entity. She wanted me broken, compliant, and bankrupt. I was calculating exactly how to handle this aggressive threat when the ICU door suddenly swung open for a second time. The atmosphere in the room instantly shifted as the air pressure dropped. Jada stepped through the doorway. She was sharply dressed in a tailored suit that projected absolute lethal authority. She took in the scene in a fraction of a second. She saw my blood-stained purse thrown carelessly on the bed. She saw the notepad demanding my financial codes. She saw Patricia leaning aggressively over a critically injured patient. Jada did not say a single word as she crossed the room in 3 long, purposeful strides. She walked directly up to Patricia, invading her personal space with terrifying confidence. Before my mother-in-law could even register the threat, Jada reached out and smoothly snatched the steaming cup of boutique coffee right out of Patricia's hand. "Excuse me," Patricia sputtered, her eyes widening in profound shock as she stumbled backward away from the bed. What do you think you are doing? Jada turned her wrist and carelessly dropped Patricia's coffee cup directly into the red biohazard trash bin stationed near the wall. It hit the bottom with a muffled thud, splashing brown liquid against the plastic liner. She then slowly turned back to face Patricia, pulling a sleek black smartphone from her pocket. The corporate litigator locked eyes with the older woman, initiating a brutal verbal takedown of the mother-in-law that was about to echo through the entire hospital wing. Patricia, you have exactly 10 seconds to exit this room before I have hospital security physically remove you and call the police to file felony extortion charges, Jada stated. Her voice was terrifyingly calm and steady, carrying the absolute authority of a senior partner who destroyed corporate giants before lunch. Patricia sputtered, her face turning a mottled shade of crimson. You have no right to speak to me that way. I am family, and I am handling my son's affairs. You are a trespasser attempting to coerce a critically injured patient into handing over secure financial data. Jada fired back, taking a deliberate step forward. She rattled off legal codes with razor-sharp precision. That is a direct violation of state law regarding the financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. I have the entire interaction recorded on the hospital security feed and my own device. If you do not turn around and walk out that door right now, I will personally ensure you are placed in handcuffs. I will file a harassment lawsuit so massive it will swallow your pension whole. The older woman opened her mouth to argue, but the sheer predatory intensity in Jada's eyes shut her down completely. Patricia recognized a losing battle. She snatched her designer coat tightly around her shoulders, her arrogant facade shattering into pieces of humiliated panic. She did not say another word as she spun on her heel and practically fled the room. The heavy door swung shut behind her, cutting off the frantic clicking of her shoes. Jada did not relax. She immediately moved to the door and engaged the heavy deadbolt. She closed the privacy blinds covering the interior glass window, blocking out the view of the busy nursing station. The room was instantly transformed from a vulnerable recovery space into a secure war room. Jada pulled a sleek silver laptop from her leather briefcase and set it gently on the edge of my rolling tray table. She pulled up a sterile vinyl chair and sat close to my bed. Her demeanor shifted from an attack dog to a calculated strategist. I have been busy while you were in surgery, Jada said, her fingers flying across the keyboard to bypass multiple encrypted firewalls. Once I secured the dashcam footage, I knew Nolan was executing a larger exit strategy. Men like him do not try to eliminate their wives unless there is a massive financial incentive. I pulled a favor with a federal contact to run a quiet sweep on your joint assets. She turned the screen toward me. The bright white light illuminated the dark room. I forced my eyes to focus, ignoring the rhythmic throbbing in my skull. I stared at the banking interface displayed on the screen. It was the joint savings account I had shared with Nolan for 4 years. The account where we deposited our bonuses, the account earmarked for our future home renovations, and our emergency safety net. The balance read $0.00. Zero. He initiated the transfer 3 hours before the crash. Jada explained, pointing to the timestamp on the digital ledger. He did not just move it to a private account, Cassidy. He liquidated everything. Stocks, bonds, the liquid cash. All of it. My chest tightened, but it was not from the fractured rib. It was the cold realization of his thorough betrayal. Where did he put it? I asked, my voice raspy and harsh. Jada pulled up a second document. It was a digital business registry from the State Department of Commerce. He funneled every single penny into a newly registered limited liability company. It was incorporated yesterday morning. He named it Apex Horizon Innovations. I scanned the document looking for the managing directors. Nolan had completely shielded his own name from the corporate structure. There was only one primary signatory listed on the operating agreement: Sienna. He completely bypassed the standard marital asset division, Jada said grimly. He parked your entire life savings into a corporate shell owned exclusively by his mistress. In a standard divorce, this would be a nightmare to untangle. He clearly wanted you out of the picture entirely, so you could never contest the corporate veil. The physical pain in my body began to recede entirely, replaced by the cold, analytical detachment of a seasoned forensic auditor. My professional instincts, the skills that made me a top-tier corporate investigator, violently kicked into high gear. I was no longer a victim lying in a hospital bed. I was an apex predator, looking at a trail of bleeding financial data. Scroll down, I commanded, my voice gaining strength and shedding the weakness of the anesthesia. Show me the raw transit logs. Show me exactly how the money moved from our joint account to her corporate shell. Jada tapped the trackpad, bringing up a dense spreadsheet filled with multi-digit routing numbers and complex SWIFT codes. Standard observers would only see a wall of confusing numbers. I saw a vibrant map. I saw the architectural blueprints of Nolan's financial crimes. I squinted at the screen, tracking the digital breadcrumbs. The money had not traveled in a straight line. Nolan was smart, but he was arrogant. He thought routing the funds through a series of intermediate holding accounts would effectively wash the money and hide the original source from any standard divorce discovery process. But he forgot what I did for a living. "Stop right there," I said, raising my bruised hand and pointing directly at a specific cluster of digits in the third column. "Zoom in on that transit node." Jada magnified the screen. The 12-digit routing identifier stared back at me. A distinct pattern of numbers that I recognized immediately from my own professional audits of major investment firms. The numbers did not belong to a standard retail bank or a private offshore holding company. My breath caught in my throat as the sheer magnitude of what Nolan had done clicked into place. The trap he had built was infinitely larger than stealing our savings. "Cassidy, what is it?" Jada asked, noticing the sudden shift in my expression. "What do you see?" I looked away from the screen and met Jada's eyes. A cold, predatory smile slowly formed on my lips despite the bandages wrapping my face. "He did not just drain our accounts, Jada," I whispered, the pieces of his grand scheme finally forming a complete and terrifying picture. "He routed our savings through this specific transit node to artificially inflate a transaction. I know these routing numbers by heart. They belong to the high-yield institutional escrow accounts managed exclusively by his employer." Jada froze, her legal mind immediately catching up to my forensic analysis. I pointed back to the screen, tapping the glass over the final destination account. "He is running a massive ghost protocol. He is taking client deposits, skimming the top, and funneling the stolen capital through our joint savings to legitimize the cash flow before dumping it into Sienna's company. He is embezzling federal funds to build Sienna's company." Jada stared at me, the gravity of my discovery hanging in the sterile hospital air. Embezzling federal funds elevated this from a messy divorce to a potential 20-year federal prison sentence. But I knew that digital trails could be erased, hard drives wiped, and paper ledgers incinerated if Nolan panicked. I could not stay in this bed while he was out there covering his tracks. Against the frantic protests of my attending physician, I ripped the intravenous line from the back of my hand and demanded the "against medical advice" discharge papers. Jada argued fiercely, citing my fractured rib and severe concussion, but my mind was operating on pure cold adrenaline. I needed physical access to his home office network. I needed to be inside the house before he realized I possessed the capacity to ruin him. Within an hour, I was sitting in the back of a damp, rattling taxi, gripping my ribs with every pothole we hit. The pain was blinding, a sharp, ragged agony that flared with every breath, but it served as a brutal reminder of exactly what I was fighting for. The cab pulled up to the curb of our sprawling suburban home. I handed the driver a crumpled bill and stepped out into the crisp afternoon air. The wide concrete driveway was completely empty. Nolan had parked his secondary vehicle inside the closed garage, maintaining the illusion of an empty, quiet residence to the outside world. I slowly unlocked the front door, the heavy oak swinging inward with a familiar soft creak. The foyer was bathed in warm, golden afternoon sunlight, looking exactly as it had the morning before the crash. But the silence was broken by the sound of hushed, intimate laughter echoing from the main staircase. I moved silently across the hardwood floor, my footsteps muffled by my hospital-issued grip socks. I rounded the corner to the grand staircase and stopped dead in my tracks. Nolan was halfway up the curved wooden steps. He was carrying Sienna in his arms, holding her tightly against his chest in a bridal carry. Sienna had her arms wrapped around his neck, her head resting intimately on his shoulder, giggling softly. She wore one of my expensive silk robes, the fabric draped loosely over her supposedly battered body. The tiny scratch on her cheek was covered by a pristine white bandage, making a mockery of the massive blood-soaked dressing wrapped tightly around my own skull. Nolan froze mid-step the second he saw me standing at the bottom of the stairs. The intimate smile vanished from his face, instantly replaced by a tight, calculating mask. Sienna let out a sharp, theatrical gasp and buried her face into his neck, playing the role of the terrified, fragile victim to absolute perfection. For a split second, I saw raw panic flash in my husband's eyes. He had assumed I would be confined to a hospital bed for at least another week, leaving him free rein over the house and our assets. He recovered with terrifying speed. He did not drop Sienna. He did not rush down the stairs to help his severely injured wife. Instead, he tightened his grip on his mistress and glared down at me with pure, unadulterated condescension. "What are you doing here, Cassidy?" he demanded, his voice echoing sharply in the large foyer. "The doctors specifically told me they were keeping you under heavy sedation." "I discharged myself," I replied, forcing my voice to remain low and steady, concealing the ragged pain in my chest. "I wanted to come home." Nolan shook his head instantly, pivoting to a tone of defensive, aggressive concern. "You are hallucinating from the concussion, Cass. You are completely confused. I checked on you in the emergency room thoroughly, but the doctors said you just needed sleep. Sienna, on the other hand, has absolutely no family, no one to care for her. I had to step up and be a decent human being. You are misinterpreting a simple act of charity because your brain is scrambled." The absolute audacity of his lie was staggering. He had literally crossed my name off a surgical consent form to save her first, and now he was framing his infidelity as a noble rescue mission. Sienna peeked over his shoulder, her eyes wide with fake innocence. "I am so sorry, Cassidy," she whispered, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "I was just feeling so weak and Nolan is so strong." Nolan did not even let me respond to her performance. He issued his next command with the casual cruelty of a dictator addressing a peasant. "You need to sleep in the downstairs guest room tonight," he stated, not asking for my permission, but dictating my reality. "Sienna has severe muscle spasms from the impact. She needs the orthopedic mattress in the master bedroom for her back. The stairs are too dangerous for her right now. You can manage the guest bed just fine." He was subjugating me in my own home. He was banishing me to a cramped downstairs room while he carried the woman he was funding with stolen federal money into the bed we had shared for 4 years. A furious, screaming rage clawed at my throat. I wanted to hurl the crystal vase from the entryway table directly at his head. I wanted to tell him about the dashcam footage, about Jada, about the federal escrow accounts. I wanted to watch his arrogant face crumble into sheer terror. But a forensic auditor never tips their hand before the trap is fully armed. If I screamed, if I fought back, I would confirm his accusation that I was hysterical. I would give him the excuse to call the police and have me forcibly removed for being a danger to myself and his delicate guest. I needed to remain completely invisible until midnight, so I swallowed the bile rising in my throat. I let my shoulders slump forward, mimicking the exact posture of a confused, exhausted, and docile wife. I forced my eyes to look dull and glassy, entirely devoid of the lethal intelligence he had always underestimated. "You are right, Nolan," I murmured softly, letting my voice waver just enough to sound pathetic and compliant. "My head is spinning terribly. The guest room is fine. I just need to lie down." Nolan visibly relaxed, a smug, triumphant smirk curling the corner of his mouth. He believed he had won. He believed I was exactly the weak, manageable problem he had always designed me to be. "Good," he replied sharply. "Do not disturb us. She needs absolute quiet." He turned back around and continued carrying his mistress up the stairs toward the master suite. I stood perfectly still at the bottom of the staircase, leaning heavily against the banister. I watched them disappear into the upper hallway, listening to the heavy click of my own bedroom door locking from the inside. I slowly smiled, the meekness vanishing from my face, replaced by a cold, calculating resolve. They thought they had secured the high ground. They had absolutely no idea that by sending me to the downstairs guest room, Nolan had just handed me unrestricted, unmonitored access to the one room that mattered most. His home office was located exactly 10 feet down the hall from my new bed, and my midnight trap was already being set. The digital clock on the guest room nightstand finally clicked to exactly 2 o'clock in the morning. I had spent the last 4 hours staring at the shadowed ceiling, counting the agonizing thuds of my own heartbeat against my shattered ribs. Upstairs, the muffled sounds of clinking glasses and intermittent laughter had slowly faded into the heavy, absolute silence of deep sleep. Nolan always was a heavy sleeper after consuming a few drinks of premium scotch. I swung my legs over the edge of the mattress, biting my lip hard to trap the groan of pain that threatened to escape my throat. The hallway was a tunnel of absolute blackness. I moved with agonizing precision, sliding my hospital-issued grip socks across the hardwood floor to avoid a single floorboard creak. Every breath felt like inhaling shards of broken glass. My skull throbbed in rhythm with my pulse serving as a brutal physical reminder of my husband's calculated cruelty. But the physical agony was entirely eclipsed by the cold, burning need for hard data. I reached the heavy oak door of Nolan's home office. The handle turned smoothly under my grip. I slipped inside and eased the door shut, leaving it unlatched by a fraction of an inch to prevent the loud click of the metal mechanism. The room smelled of expensive leather and his signature cologne. Moonlight filtered through the plantation shutters, casting long, sharp shadows across the floor. I ignored his dual-monitor computer terminal and moved straight to the built-in mahogany bookcase. Behind a row of heavy legal textbooks sat the wall safe. It was a biometric and keypad combination vault supposedly impregnable to any standard intrusion. Nolan had bragged about its military-grade encryption when he installed it last year. He had smugly refused to give me the access code, citing attorney-client confidentiality. He severely underestimated the woman he married. I did not need his fingerprint or his code. 3 months ago, when I updated our home network router, I had quietly installed a secondary hidden subnet. I linked it directly to the smart home hub that managed the security features of his precious safe. I pulled my smartphone from the pocket of my sweatpants. My fingers flew across the screen, opening the hidden terminal application. I executed the backdoor command protocol. A soft mechanical whir emanated from the wall, followed by the heavy metallic thud of the locking bolts retracting. The heavy steel door swung open on perfectly oiled hinges. I reached inside, my hands brushing past his expensive watch collection and a velvet tray of gold cufflinks. I felt toward the very back, pressing my fingers against the false panel I knew he kept there. It popped open with a quiet, satisfying click. I pulled out a thick, leather-bound physical ledger and a manila folder stuffed with printed bank statements. I sank onto the thick Persian rug, ignoring the screaming protest of my rib cage, and clicked on my phone's flashlight, setting it to the absolute lowest brightness. The narrow beam illuminated the pages. The numbers leaped out at me, confirming everything I suspected and exponentially expanding the nightmare. I flipped through the printed statements. This was the physical paper trail of his ghost protocol, but the manila folder held something far more devastating than embezzled corporate escrow funds. I pulled out a thick stack of legal documents bearing the official embossed seal of a notary public. My breath caught in my throat, causing a sharp spasm of pain in my chest. It was a deed of trust and a legally binding promissory note. Nolan had taken out a massive second mortgage on our house. The property was a premarital asset purchased entirely with my own savings before we ever met. It was solely in my name. The document staring back at me bore my signature, heavily forged, but passable to a careless bank officer rushing a closing. The notary stamp belonged to a junior partner at Nolan's firm, who likely signed it blindly as a favor. The loan amount listed on the front page was exactly $2 million. The sheer magnitude of his malice settled over me like a suffocating blanket. His master plan was never just to leave me or merely drain our joint savings accounts. If I died in that staged car crash, the fraudulent debt would wipe out my entire estate, leaving my family with absolutely nothing, while he walked away with clean hands. But if I survived, he was going to divorce me and leave me holding a $2 million fraudulent bag. He planned to leave me utterly bankrupt, homeless, and facing federal fraud charges for a massive loan I never authorized. He and Sienna would vanish with the $2 million in clean, unassailable cash washed through his corporate escrow scheme and funneled directly into her new limited liability company. He had engineered my complete financial and physical annihilation with terrifying precision. I was staring at the forged signature when a sudden sound shattered the silence of the house. The unmistakable creak of a floorboard on the upper landing. A heavy footstep. Then another. They were not the light, hurried steps of Sienna. They were the slow, measured footfalls of a large man. Nolan was awake. The footsteps reached the top of the stairs and began descending with heavy purpose. My heart slammed against my breastbone. Panic threatened to override my logical processing, but my forensic auditor instincts seized absolute control of my nervous system. I raised my phone and rapidly snapped high-resolution photographs of every single page of the forged mortgage documents and the physical ledger. The camera shutter was completely silent. The footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs and began moving down the hallway directly toward the office. I shoved the ledger and the folder back into the hidden compartment. I pushed the false panel shut and quietly pressed the heavy steel door of the safe until the locking bolts engaged with a soft mechanical whir. The footsteps stopped directly outside the door. I threw myself to the floor and scrambled under the massive mahogany desk, pulling my legs tight against my chest in the absolute darkness. The brass doorknob slowly began to turn. The brass doorknob turned with a sharp metallic click. I held my breath, pressing my spine hard against the wooden modesty panel of the desk. A pair of bare feet stepped heavily onto the Persian rug. Nolan paused just inside the threshold. His breathing filled the quiet room. He walked toward the window, checking the plantation shutters. His gaze swept the room at eye level, completely missing my shadowed form, tucked tightly beneath his workspace. Muttering a curse under his breath, he turned and exited, pulling the door shut until the latch clicked. I waited 20 agonizing minutes before crawling out and slipping back to the guest room. My phone was secured against my chest like a loaded weapon, holding the explosive digital evidence of his massive fraud. Sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows the next morning, highlighting the dust motes dancing in the air. I stood at the cold marble island, gripping a warm mug of chamomile tea. Every shallow breath was a sharp reminder of my fractured ribs, but my mind was operating with crystalline clarity. The high-resolution photographs of the forged mortgage and the physical ledger were already uploaded to a secure cloud server safely out of Nolan's reach. I was mentally calculating my next tactical move when the kitchen door swung open. Nolan walked in wearing a perfectly pressed, casual suit. His face was set in a mask of deep manufactured sorrow. Right behind him was Patricia, her lips pursed in an expression of grim determination. She was pushing a medical wheelchair. Seated in the chair was Sienna, wearing a thick neck brace and holding a crumpled tissue. Finally, a tall man with silver hair and a tweed jacket stepped into the kitchen. He carried a leather folio and wore the practiced, soothing smile of a seasoned medical professional. They fanned out across the room, strategically blocking the exits. It was a perfectly choreographed ambush. "Cassidy, please sit down," Nolan said softly, his voice dripping with condescending pity. "We need to have a very serious conversation. This is Dr. Evans. He is a close colleague and a highly respected psychiatrist. I asked him to come by this morning because we are all incredibly worried about your mental state." I did not move toward the chair. I kept my hands wrapped tightly around my mug, letting the ceramic warmth ground me. Worried about what exactly, I asked, keeping my tone entirely neutral. Nolan exchanged a heavily rehearsed look of distress with his mother. "Your behavior yesterday was erratic and deeply disturbing." He continued, taking a slow step forward. "Discharging yourself against strict medical advice. wandering around the house in a daze, muttering to yourself. You have suffered a massive head trauma, Cass. Dr. Evans believes you are experiencing severe post-concussion paranoia. You are completely disconnected from reality, and you are becoming a dangerous liability to yourself. Sienna let out a soft theatrical sob from her wheelchair. She dabbed at her perfectly dry eyes with the tissue. Please listen to him, she whimpered, her voice trembling with fake vulnerability. We just want you to get help, Cassidy. No one is angry with you. We know the terrible accident scrambled your brain. We just want you to be safe. Dr. Evans stepped forward, placing his folio on the marble island. He looked at me with an infuriatingly calm clinical gaze. Mrs. Wilson, trauma often fractures our perception of reality. He began, his tone slow and patronizing, as if speaking to a frightened toddler. Your husband tells me you have been making wildly unfounded accusations. You believe people are conspiring against you. You are exhibiting classic signs of acute paranoid delusion triggered by the blunt force trauma to your frontal lobe. I stared at the doctor, processing the lethal nature of the trap they had just sprung. Nolan was not just trying to discredit my memory. He was actively laying the legal groundwork to strip away my autonomy. If a licensed psychiatrist documented that I was exhibiting severe paranoid delusions and declared me an immediate danger to myself, Nolan could legally place me under an involuntary 72-hour psychiatric hold. He would automatically become my medical proxy. He would have absolute legal authority to sign documents on my behalf, control my remaining assets, and lock me away in a secure ward while he finalized the fraudulent $2 million mortgage and emptied the escrow accounts. Dr. Evans leaned closer, initiating his psychological attack. Do you often feel like your husband is hiding things from you, Cassidy? He asked gently, his eyes tracking my every micro-expression. Do you find yourself inventing complex scenarios to explain away the simple, tragic reality of a car crash? It is perfectly normal for the traumatized mind to create villains to cope with random pain. Tell me, do you feel an overwhelming urge to lash out violently at the people trying to care for you right now? He wanted me to scream. Nolan wanted me to throw my hot tea against the wall. Patricia wanted me to lunge across the kitchen and slap the fake tears right off Sienna's pristine face. They had stacked the deck specifically to provoke a hysterical, violent reaction. Any display of raw anger, any mention of the forged deeds, the Mistress, or the embezzled federal funds would instantly be classified as a paranoid delusion. It would be the final nail in my coffin, validating Dr. Evans's fake diagnosis and handing Nolan the keys to my complete destruction. The rage burning inside my chest was a blinding white-hot inferno. I wanted to tear them all to pieces. But I was a forensic auditor. I did not operate on wild emotion. I operated on cold, undeniable data. If I lost my temper, I lost my legal autonomy. I looked at Nolan, then at Patricia, then at the smirking mistress in her wheelchair, and finally at the corrupt doctor holding the pen that could sign away my freedom. I slowly lifted the mug to my lips and took a long, steady sip of my tea. I let the silence stretch, forcing them to wait, forcing the tension in the room to build until it was suffocating. I buried the roaring fury deep down in my gut and locked it behind a wall of pure ice. I lowered the mug, resting it softly on the marble counter, and prepared to dismantle his entire psychological trap with terrifying cold logic. I lowered the mug, resting it softly on the marble counter, and prepared to dismantle his entire psychological trap with terrifying cold logic. The ceramic clinked sharply against the stone, a definitive punctuation mark in the heavy, suffocating silence of the kitchen. Dr. Evans maintained his practiced, patronizing smile, his pen hovering lazily over his leather folio, waiting for the hysterical outburst Nolan had so carefully primed him to expect. I did not scream. I did not throw my tea. I simply adjusted my posture, aligning my spine perfectly straight, despite the agonizing protest of my fractured ribs, and fixed my gaze directly on the psychiatrist. Dr. Evans! I began, my voice carrying the crisp, modulated cadence of a corporate auditor dissecting a fraudulent ledger. Before I answer any of your leading questions regarding my perceived paranoia, I require you to clarify the exact clinical nature of this impromptu morning visit. Are you currently operating in your capacity as a licensed medical professional conducting an official psychiatric evaluation? Or are you trespassing in my home under the guise of a social call? Dr. Evans blinked, clearly thrown by the absolute absence of emotion in my tone. His smile faltered for a fraction of a second before he recovered. Cassidy, there is no need for hostility. I am simply here as a concerned friend of your husband. We all want to ensure you are processing your trauma in a healthy manner. Let us dispense with the rehearsed pleasantries, doctor, I replied, my voice dropping to a temperature that practically froze the air in the room. You are not here to discuss my coping mechanisms. You are here to establish a fabricated baseline for a Section 5150 involuntary psychiatric hold. You and my husband are attempting to weaponize my recent traumatic brain injury to declare me legally incompetent. By having a licensed professional document, severe paranoid delusions, you provide Nolan with the immediate medical and financial proxy he needs to seize absolute control of my estate. Patricia gasped loudly, her hand flying to her chest in a display of mocked horror. Nolan took a sudden aggressive step forward. Cass, stop talking like a lawyer, he demanded, his voice thick with fake anxiety. You are not making any sense. You are rambling. I ignored my husband entirely, keeping my eyes locked on the psychiatrist. Dr. Evans, as a board-certified practitioner, you are undoubtedly familiar with the American Psychiatric Association's strict ethical guidelines, specifically the principles regarding dual relationships and conflicts of interest. You have a pre-existing personal relationship with my husband. Attempting to diagnose and subsequently institutionalize your friend's wife without a prior clinical history, without an impartial secondary review, and without an active emergency warrant is not merely an ethical violation. It is diagnostic manipulation for financial gain. It is grounds for the immediate and permanent revocation of your medical license. The color began to drain from the doctor's face. His pen was no longer hovering. It was gripped tightly in his suddenly white-knuckled hand. He glanced sideways at Nolan, a flicker of genuine uncertainty crossing his clinical facade. I did not give him a chance to recover. I raised my left wrist deliberately, angling it so the digital face of my smartwatch caught the morning sunlight streaming through the windows. A small red recording indicator was blinking in a steady rhythmic pulse. Just to ensure there is no misunderstanding regarding my absolute lucidity, I should inform you that this entire conversation has been recorded from the moment I entered this kitchen, I stated, my voice echoing with lethal precision. The audio file is not stored locally. It is currently streaming directly to a secure cloud server monitored by my legal counsel, Jada Blackwell. She is a senior litigation partner, and she is explicitly waiting for my signal to forward this interaction directly to the State Medical Board, the Hospital Ethics Committee, and the local authorities to file charges for attempted medical coercion. The mention of Jada's name was the absolute finishing blow. Dr. Evans knew exactly who she was. Every professional in the city's corporate and medical sectors knew Jada Blackwell's reputation for completely destroying careers in the courtroom. The psychiatrist realized in a fraction of a second that the liability of this favor had massively outweighed any potential asset. He was looking at the abrupt end of his entire medical career. Dr. Evans frantically snapped his leather folio shut, his hands shaking slightly as he shoved his pen into his pocket. He turned to Nolan, his professional demeanor entirely replaced by raw, unadulterated panic. Nolan, you explicitly told me she was incoherent, aggressive, and a direct danger to herself. Dr. Evans hissed, his voice dropping into a harsh whisper. This woman is completely lucid. I cannot help you. Do not ever contact my office again. Without waiting for a response, the doctor turned on his heel and practically sprinted out of the kitchen. The heavy thud of the front door slamming shut echoed through the house, sealing the utter failure of their psychological ambush. The kitchen fell into a dead absolute silence. I slowly turned my gaze back to my husband. The shift in Nolan was instantaneous and terrifying. With his primary plan completely ruined, and his medical proxy scheme destroyed, he no longer had any reason to maintain the facade. The caring, concerned husband act dissolved into thin air. He glared at me, his eyes burning with pure, unfiltered hatred. The muscles in his jaw ticked furiously, and his hands were clenched into tight fists at his sides. He realized far too late that he had severely underestimated the woman he was trying to bury. Patricia stood frozen against the counter, completely speechless, her arrogant entitlement entirely shattered by the clinical execution of my defense. In the wheelchair, Sienna's theatrical performance came to an abrupt halt. The fake tears instantly dried up, replaced by a nervous, calculating stare, as she realized she was not dealing with a broken victim. I did not gloat. I did not raise my voice or offer a triumphant smile. I simply picked up my mug of chamomile tea and walked slowly past them, forcing my posture to remain perfectly upright, despite the excruciating pain radiating through my chest. "Excuse me," I said quietly, as I navigated the tense space between my furious husband and his mistress. "I need to go rest my scrambled brain." I walked steadily down the hallway and entered the downstairs guest room. I closed the door firmly behind me and engaged the heavy brass lock. The moment the mechanism clicked into place, I set the mug down and pulled my smartphone from my pocket. I dialed a highly encrypted number. Jada answered on the very first ring. Phase 1 failed for him. I stated, my voice completely devoid of the weakness I had projected just moments earlier. "Execute the IRS lockdown. Let's starve them out." Jada's crisp voice echoed through the encrypted connection, confirming the directive before she terminated the call. I tossed the smartphone onto the bed and retrieved my heavily encrypted work laptop from the bottom of my overnight bag. I booted the machine and connected to a secure virtual private network, routing my digital footprint through 3 different international servers before accessing the domestic financial grid. It was time to drop the blade. I opened my proprietary forensic auditing software. The program was designed to trace laundered money through complex corporate shell structures, but today I was using it as a precision weapon. I accessed the secure whistleblower portal for the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. I attached the high-resolution photographs of Nolan's physical ledger, cross-referencing the offshore escrow accounts with his domestic tax filings. I filed the report anonymously using a specialized encryption key that guaranteed immediate automated flagging by their preliminary screening algorithms. Next, I targeted the bank holding the fraudulent $2 million second mortgage. Using a disguised email relay, I sent the forged deed of trust directly to their executive fraud prevention unit. I included a detailed breakdown of the biometric signature discrepancies and flagged the notary stamp for internal review. The bank risk management software would freeze the pending loan disbursement within minutes. With the federal and corporate traps armed, I shifted my focus to our immediate domestic finances. I logged into our joint banking portal. I possessed primary administrative rights to all shared accounts, a detail Nolan had carelessly ignored during our marriage. I executed a hard freeze on every single joint credit card, citing suspected identity theft. I instantly suspended the overdraft protections and locked the primary checking account. Then I accessed my own personal liquid assets. Jada had already established a high-security offshore trust in the Cayman Islands under a shell corporation completely isolated from my marital estate. With a few rapid keystrokes, I authorized a massive wire transfer, routing my entire life savings out of domestic jurisdiction and into the impregnable offshore account. I watched the progress bar hit 100%. The screen flashed a bright green confirmation message. Nolan was officially locked out of the financial system. He had absolutely zero access to capital. I closed the laptop and sat in the quiet guest room, listening intently to the acoustics of the large house. The reaction time was faster than I anticipated. Within 20 minutes, the heavy silence was shattered by the sharp, aggressive ringing of a cell phone upstairs. It was Nolan's personal line. The ringing stopped briefly, only to be replaced by the harsh trill of his secure work phone. Then both phones began ringing simultaneously. I could hear the heavy thud of his footsteps pacing rapidly across the master bedroom ceiling. His muffled voice carried down the staircase, sharp and frantic. I leaned back against the headboard, savoring the sweet symphony of his panic. 30 minutes later, the heavy oak front door banged open. Sienna's voice echoed through the grand foyer, shrill and practically bordering on a screech. "Nolan!" she yelled, her high heels clicking aggressively against the hardwood floor. "My platinum card just declined at the boutique." I was humiliated. The manager had to take back the entire couture collection for the company launch gala. The terminal said the account was frozen for suspected fraud. "What is going on?" Nolan's voice rumbled from the top of the stairs, devoid of its usual smooth arrogance. "The bank is blocking my access," he barked. "All the cards are dead. Even the corporate expense accounts are returning error codes. The loan officer just left me a voicemail saying the mortgage disbursement is halted pending a federal compliance review." The sheer panic in his tone was intoxicating. He was a man accustomed to ultimate control, suddenly discovering he was trapped in a falling elevator. I heard Sienna start to cry, genuine tears this time, complaining about the ruined gala, while Nolan frantically punched numbers into his phone, screaming at automated banking menus. I calmly packed my laptop back into its protective case and slid it under the mattress. I adjusted my hospital gown over my sweatpants and sat on the edge of the bed, waiting for the inevitable realization to hit him. He was a narcissistic sociopath, but he was not an idiot. It would only take him a few minutes of analyzing the timeline to deduce the single variable that had changed in his perfectly constructed world. The heavy footsteps pounded down the main staircase, moving with terrifying velocity. He did not bother turning the brass doorknob to the guest room. The solid oak door exploded inward with a deafening crash, the brass lock splintering out of the wooden frame under the force of his violent kick. Nolan stood in the shattered doorway, his chest heaving. His face was flushed a dark mottled red, and the veins in his neck bulged against his collar. The carefully tailored suit jacket was discarded, and his silk tie was hanging loose. He looked like a cornered animal. "What did you do?" he roared, his voice echoing off the walls. "The banking executives are telling me a primary account holder initiated a catastrophic lockdown. The IRS just flagged my corporate tax identification number. My entire financial network is paralyzed. Tell me right now what you did to my accounts." He stepped into the room, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles were stark white. He towered over me, radiating physical threat, trying to use his sheer size to intimidate me into submission. I remained perfectly still, seated on the edge of the mattress. I did not flinch at the shattered door. I did not cower from his rage. I looked up into his furious, terrified eyes with absolute calm. I slowly raised my hand and gently pointed a single finger toward my bruised, healing ribs. Then I smiled. I watched the exact moment my husband realized physical intimidation was useless against a woman who held the digital detonator to his entire life. The sight of my serene smile completely broke his forward momentum. He stood in the splintered doorway of the guest room, his chest heaving, his large fists unclenching and clenching at his sides. He desperately wanted to strike me. The violent impulse radiated from him in palpable waves, but the survival instincts of a cornered white-collar criminal quickly overrode his brute rage. He knew that if he laid a single finger on my battered body, the police would be called, and the subsequent federal investigation into my frozen assets would happen in a brightly lit precinct interrogation room instead of behind closed doors. He spat a vile curse, spun around on his heel, and stormed back up the staircase. I did not sleep for the rest of the night. I spent the remaining hours of darkness meticulously packing a single rolling suitcase. I packed only my essential electronics, my encrypted hard drives, a few changes of comfortable clothing, and the irreplaceable antique jewelry my grandmother had left me. I left behind the expensive designer dresses Nolan had purchased for me to wear as arm candy to his corporate dinners. I left behind the imported perfumes and the luxury shoes. I stripped myself of absolutely everything that belonged to the fraudulent life we had shared. By the time the sun began to rise, painting the suburban sky in streaks of pale pink and bruised purple, I was completely ready for their desperate counterattack. I knew Nolan would immediately retreat to his mother for tactical support. Patricia was his ultimate enforcer. At precisely 8 o'clock in the morning, The heavy brass knocker on the front door echoed sharply through the foyer. I was already sitting quietly in the kitchen, sipping a fresh cup of green tea, my packed suitcase parked neatly by the marble island counter. I listened as Nolan rushed downstairs to unlock the door. He ushered Patricia inside, followed immediately by the heavy, synchronized footsteps of two massive men in tactical black uniforms. Private security. Patricia had brought her own personal mercenaries to handle the dirty work. I remained perfectly seated as the procession marched aggressively into the kitchen. Patricia led the vanguard, her face contoured into a tight mask of aristocratic fury. She wore a tailored suit, her signature pearls resting against her throat, like battle armor. Nolan stood slightly behind her, looking exhausted and desperate, while Sienna was already perched comfortably on the living room sofa, pretending to read a magazine but watching us like a hawk. The two security guards flanked the kitchen doorway, crossing their thick arms over their chests, in a blatant display of physical intimidation. Patricia marched directly to the marble island and slammed a heavy manila envelope onto the surface. The sharp slap of paper against stone echoed loudly. "You are leaving this property immediately, Cassidy," she announced, her voice trembling with manufactured authority. "This is a formal eviction notice. My son is the primary owner of this residence, and you are officially trespassing. You have exactly 24 hours to vacate the premises, but given your violently unstable behavior yesterday, I have hired these gentlemen to ensure you leave right now." I looked down at the document. It was a masterpiece of legal fiction. They had somehow managed to forge a preliminary eviction mandate, likely utilizing another corrupt contact within Nolan's extensive network. It was entirely illegal and would never hold up in a legitimate court, but fighting it right now would require calling the local police, initiating a messy domestic dispute, and giving them the chaotic spectacle they desperately desired. I had absolutely no intention of fighting for a house that was about to become ground zero for a massive federal raid. When I did not immediately react to the forged document, Patricia's aristocratic mask slipped, revealing the vicious, venomous woman lurking underneath. She leaned across the marble counter, her eyes narrowing into cold slits. "You always were a parasitic drain on my son," she hissed, her voice dropping into a register of pure cruelty. "You held him back, you stifled his ambition, and worst of all, you could not even fulfill the most basic biological duty of a wife." The kitchen grew dead silent. Even Nolan shifted uncomfortably at the sudden sharp escalation. Patricia was going directly for the throat, weaponizing the most agonizing trauma of my entire life. "You are a barren, useless woman, Cassidy," she sneered, her words chosen specifically to inflict maximum psychological damage. "You could not give Nolan a child. You subjected him to the misery of a miscarriage, and then wallowed in your own pathetic self-pity. Look at Sienna." She pointed a manicured finger toward the living room where the mistress was watching with a satisfied smirk. "Sienna is young, she is vibrant. She is going to give Nolan the family and the legacy you completely failed to provide. She is unlocking his true potential while you sit here playing childish financial games." 5 years ago, those words would have shattered me into a million irreparable pieces. I would have collapsed onto the hardwood floor weeping. I would have begged for her validation. But looking at Patricia now, I felt absolutely nothing. No pain, no sorrow, only a profound clinical disgust for the people I had allowed into my life. They were entirely predictable in their malice. I finished my tea, placed the ceramic mug gently into the stainless steel sink, and turned to face them. I did not scream. I did not attempt to argue the legality of the forged eviction notice or explain that the house was solely in my name. I simply reached down and wrapped my fingers around the telescopic handle of my rolling suitcase. The two mercenaries shifted their weight, their heavy tactical boots squeaking slightly on the floor, fully expecting a hysterical woman to forcibly resist. I walked smoothly past Patricia, ignoring her existence entirely, and moved into the living room. Every step sent a sharp spike of agony through my fractured ribs, but I forced my posture to remain impeccably straight. Sienna sat up straighter on the sofa, clutching her unnecessary neck brace, her eyes widening slightly as I approached. I reached into the pocket of my coat and pulled out the heavy ring of brass house keys. I held them out, letting the metal jingle softly in the tense air. Sienna hesitated for a fraction of a second before snatching the keys from my hand, a smug, triumphant grin spreading across her glossy lips. She believed she had conquered my kingdom. She believed she had won the war. I adjusted my grip on my suitcase and walked toward the heavy oak front door. I pulled it open, letting the crisp morning air flood the stuffy, toxic foyer. I paused on the threshold and turned back to look at the three of them standing victorious in my home. Patricia was glaring at my back, Nolan was staring at the floor, and Sienna was admiring her new keys. I caught Patricia's eye and offered a thin, razor-sharp smile. "Enjoy the house," I said, my voice echoing clearly across the entryway. "Just a heads up, the plumbing gets a little loud at night." Without waiting for their reaction, I stepped out onto the wide concrete driveway and pulled the heavy door shut behind me. I walked straight down the driveway toward the sleek black sedan idling quietly at the curb. The rear door swung open as I approached. Jada was sitting in the back seat, tapping away on a secure tablet. I slid into the leather interior, closing the door on the wreckage of my marriage, leaving the toxic family locked inside the trap to celebrate their spectacularly fake victory. The leather seat of Jada's town car embraced my aching ribs as we pulled away from the curb. I did not look back at the sprawling suburban fortress I had just surrendered. Jada tapped her manicured fingernail against her steering wheel, a predatory smile playing on her lips. We navigated the morning traffic in comfortable silence, the tension of the past 24 hours melting away into cold, calculated anticipation. 20 minutes later, we stepped into the private elevator, ascending to the top floor of Blackwell & Associates. Jada's corner office was a fortress of glass and steel overlooking the financial district. She gestured for me to take the plush armchair opposite her massive mahogany desk, immediately pouring 2 glasses of sparkling water from a crystal decanter. "You played that flawlessly," Jada said, sliding a sleek tablet across the desk. The screen displayed a live feed from the hidden microcameras I had installed in the living room and kitchen weeks ago. I watched Patricia uncork a bottle of vintage champagne, the pop practically vibrating through the tablet speakers. Nolan slumped onto the sofa next to Sienna, looking ragged but deeply relieved. "They think they just excised the tumor," Jada noted, watching the screen with clinical fascination. I took a slow sip of water, allowing the carbonation to soothe my dry throat. "They did exactly what I needed them to do." I explained, my voice steady and devoid of any lingering adrenaline. "By arriving with a forged eviction notice and explicitly claiming Nolan is the primary owner of the property on recorded audio, Patricia just handed us the final piece of the puzzle." Jada's eyes gleamed with understanding. "The tax lien," she murmured. "Precisely," I nodded. "Yesterday, when I flagged the fraudulent second mortgage to the bank fraud department, I concurrently filed a priority whistleblower report with the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. I provided them with undeniable proof that the funds used to secure that property were tied to Nolan's offshore money laundering operation. But an investigation takes time unless there is an immediate flight risk or active fraud being perpetrated on the asset itself." Jada leaned forward, interlacing her fingers on the mahogany surface. "And by physically seizing the property using forged documents, they escalated the status from a pending investigation to an active, ongoing federal crime." I smiled, the physical pain in my chest entirely eclipsed by the brilliance of the trap. "Exactly. By forcing me out and claiming sole ownership today, Nolan legally bound himself to a toxic asset the federal government flagged for immediate seizure. He essentially walked into a bank vault, locked the door from the inside, and swallowed the key just as the alarms started blaring. Because the property is now technically considered a staging ground for corporate fraud and massive tax evasion, the IRS does not just freeze the deed. Under the Bank Secrecy Act and federal asset forfeiture guidelines, they physically seize the property to prevent the destruction of evidence. And because Nolan explicitly claimed ownership and physical possession this morning, anyone residing in that house is now actively trespassing on seized federal property and obstructing a federal investigation." Jada let out a low, appreciative whistle. She tapped the screen of the tablet, enlarging the live video feed. The high-definition audio picked up Patricia's arrogant voice echoing through my former kitchen. She was toasting to new beginnings, completely oblivious to the digital guillotine swinging down toward her neck. "You did not just leave them a house. Jada said, shaking her head in sheer admiration. You left them a live grenade. And they pulled the pin themselves, I replied, keeping my eyes locked on the screen. On the tablet, the celebration was reaching its absolute peak. Sienna was laughing loudly, holding up her crystal champagne flute. Her fake medical neck brace was completely forgotten, tossed carelessly onto the expensive coffee table as she leaned into Nolan. Nolan was finally managing a genuine smile, wrapping his thick arm around his mistress, clearly believing he had successfully navigated the storm and secured his stolen empire. Patricia was mid-sentence gesturing with her glass as she lectured them about how to properly redecorate the living room to entirely erase my memory from the space. Then the heavy oak front door did not simply open. It practically exploded inward with a deafening crash that made Sienna scream and drop her glass. A synchronized team of 8 federal agents wearing dark tactical windbreakers with IRSCID emblazoned across their backs in bold yellow lettering flooded the grand foyer. They moved with terrifying coordinated precision, instantly fanning out to secure the perimeter of the house. Patricia dropped her crystal champagne flute. It shattered against the hardwood floor, the expensive liquid splashing across her designer shoes and ruining her pristine slacks. Sienna let out a piercing shriek, scrambling backward over the sofa cushions in a frantic attempt to distance herself from the incoming raid. Nolan shot to his feet, his face draining of all color, his previous arrogance entirely obliterated by absolute terror. The lead federal agent stepped directly into the living room, his posture rigid and commanding. He did not ask for permission to enter. He held up a thick stack of legal documents sealed with heavy federal stamps. Nolan Evans, the agent, barked, his voice carrying the absolute authority of the federal government. We are executing an immediate property seizure notice under federal asset forfeiture laws. This residence and all contents within are now the physical property of the United States government. Put your hands where I can see them and step away from the documents on the table. Nolan stood frozen, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. The champagne soaked into the expensive rugs as the agents swarmed the living room, sealing the toxic family inside the exact cage they had fought so hard to steal. The live feed on the tablet abruptly went black. An agent had likely swept the living room for recording devices and severed the connection. Jada tapped the dark screen with a manicured nail and leaned back in her leather executive chair. The silence in the corner office was profound, a sharp contrast to the absolute chaos we had just unleashed miles away in the suburbs. I did not celebrate. I did not cheer. I simply exhaled a long, controlled breath and mentally shifted to the next phase of the operation. The federal seizure of the house was a massive tactical victory, but it was only a containment maneuver. It stripped them of their physical sanctuary and immediate domestic capital. To truly dismantle Nolan, I needed to obliterate his professional infrastructure and salt the earth so nothing could ever grow back. Jada offered me the use of her secure adjoining conference room. It was a sterile, windowless space lined with whiteboard walls and heavy oak tables perfectly suited for a war room. I set up my encrypted laptop and connected to her high-speed private server. I needed to consolidate the raw financial data I had extracted from his hidden ledger into a standardized prosecuting format. I was deep into a complex web of offshore routing numbers when my cell phone vibrated against the wooden table. The caller ID displayed a blocked number. Nolan's primary phone was seized along with his assets, so I knew exactly what this was. I swiped the screen and brought the phone to my ear without speaking. The background noise was a harsh symphony of blaring car horns, shifting gears, and passing traffic. They were literally standing on the curb. Nolan's voice tore through the speaker, raw and entirely unhinged. He sounded like a man who had just watched his entire universe burn to ash. "You vindictive psycho!" he screamed, his words slurring slightly with blind rage. "Do you have any idea what you just did? They threw us out onto the street. We do not even have our coats. The agents confiscated my keys, my wallet, and my phone. I had to borrow a phone from a passing delivery driver just to call you. I am going to destroy you, Cassidy. I am going to drag you through every civil court in this state and bankrupt you. I will hire a team of doctors to declare you legally insane and lock you in a ward for the rest of your pathetic life. You are dead. Do you hear me? You are absolutely dead. I listened to the pathetic tirade with a heart rate resting at a calm 60 beats per minute. He was projecting. Every threat he hurled at me was a desperate attempt to regain control of a situation he no longer understood. He was penniless, standing on a public sidewalk in a bespoke suit, sweating in the morning humidity. He was a king without a kingdom, desperately trying to issue royal decrees to the wind. Before he could continue his frantic rambling, I heard a brief scuffle over the line. Sienna's voice suddenly replaced his sharp and breathy with a manic edge. She had clearly snatched the borrowed burner phone right out of his hand. "You think a tax glitch stops us?" She spat, her voice vibrating with aggressive delusion. "Nolan's firm is backing our tech launch tomorrow night. We are untouchable, you pathetic dropout. We are going to be billionaires by Friday, and you are going to be nothing but a footnote in our success story. Enjoy your little prank because tomorrow we take over the industry." I stared at the blank wall of the conference room, analyzing the sheer magnitude of her arrogance. She genuinely believed the IRS raid was a bureaucratic error. She was completely convinced that Nolan's corporate firm would simply shield them from federal asset forfeiture and sweep the entire mess under a rug. She still believed the tech launch was going to happen. The delusion was staggering, but it confirmed exactly what I needed to know. They were banking their entire survival on the corporate launch gala scheduled for the following evening. They believed the venture capital flowing into that new tech initiative would provide the liquidity they needed to bypass the frozen accounts and hire elite defense attorneys. I did not offer a rebuttal. I did not laugh or point out that her precious tech launch was built on a foundation of heavily laundered cartel money. I simply pulled the phone away from my ear and tapped the red button. The line went dead. I placed the phone face down on the table, cutting off their only tether to me. Arguments were for people who lacked leverage. I had hard, irrefutable data. I turned my attention back to the dual monitors on my workstation. I spent the next 4 hours meticulously compiling every scrap of evidence I had gathered over the past few weeks. I formatted the biometric signature discrepancies from the second mortgage. I charted the exact flow of illicit capital from the Cayman Island shell corporations directly into the operating budget of the new tech startup they were launching tomorrow. I cross-referenced the dates, times, and IP addresses of every single illegal wire transfer Nolan had executed using the firm's proprietary servers. I hit the print command. In the corner of the room, the heavy-duty commercial printer hummed to life. It began churning out pages with rhythmic, mechanical precision. It printed for a very long time. When the machine finally fell silent, I gathered the massive 500-page dossier. The stack of paper was inches thick, heavy, with the undeniable weight of corporate treason and federal wire fraud. It was a meticulously indexed roadmap of Nolan's entire criminal enterprise, complete with banking SWIFT codes and offshore account passwords. I walked over to the supply cabinet and retrieved 2 heavy-duty shipping envelopes. I split the dossier into 2 identical stacks, sliding one into each envelope. I sealed the flaps, pressing firmly along the adhesive edges. On the front of the first envelope, I printed the direct address for the regional director of the Securities and Exchange Commission. On the second envelope, I wrote the address for the Federal Bureau of Investigation White-Collar Crime Division. I placed both packages squarely in the center of the oak table, perfectly aligned and ready for the courier. The trap was set, and tomorrow night the jaws would snap shut permanently. I stared at the 2 sealed envelopes resting on the center of the oak table. Jada entered the conference room carrying a fresh carafe of coffee and firmly locked the heavy door behind her. She eyed the packages but immediately shook her head. "Before we hand those over to the federal courier," she stated, setting the carafe down, "we need to conduct a final brutal stress test of your digital master file. If we are sending this to the Securities and Exchange Commission and the FBI, I want absolute certainty there is not a single structural flaw in your evidence." I pulled up the primary data visualization on the dual monitors. A complex web of red and green transaction lines populated the screens. illuminating the true depravity of my husband. I mapped out the precise architecture of his embezzlement. Nolan had not merely skimmed profits or inflated corporate expense accounts. He had systematically stolen exactly $15 million. He specifically targeted the most vulnerable demographic within his firm's portfolio. The victims were elderly clients, retirees suffering from severe cognitive decline, and widows who trusted him explicitly with their life savings. Nolan had ruthlessly liquidated their low-risk municipal bonds and conservative trust funds. He then fabricated quarterly performance statements to completely conceal the missing capital from their families. I highlighted the digital signatures proving Nolan manually bypassed internal compliance protocols to execute the liquidations. It was a brilliant, terrifying display of predatory finance. I traced the stolen $15 million through a labyrinth of offshore routing numbers. He pushed the stolen liquidity through 3 separate shell corporations in the Cayman Islands, effectively washing the origin of the money. The final destination for every single stolen dollar was the corporate operating account of Sienna's highly publicized tech startup. It was a spectacular fraud. Sienna's company possessed no proprietary algorithm and no actual engineering staff. I accessed their internal server to show Jada the raw files. The entire tech platform was a phantom constructed using plagiarized open-source code and purchased stock photography. The startup was nothing but a domestic money laundering vehicle designed to legitimize the stolen $15 million. Sienna was listed as the chief executive officer, giving Nolan complete plausible deniability on paper, while he maintained absolute control of the capital. Jada leaned over the keyboard, her eyes scanning the raw data with lethal intensity. She began cross-referencing the transaction hashes with Nolan's specific administrative credentials, linking his unique digital thumbprint to every illegal wire transfer. She worked with astonishing speed, applying her vast legal prowess to construct an impenetrable armor around my findings. Within an hour, she had drafted a watertight affidavit, completely insulating me from the blast radius. She logged into a secured federal portal and filed an emergency petition under the Securities and Exchange Commission whistleblower program. By invoking specific provisions of the Dodd-Frank Act, she secured my absolute federal immunity. If Nolan's firm attempted to drag me into their inevitable collapse, Jada had ensured I was legally untouchable. We shifted our focus to the immediate timeline. The launch gala for Sienna's fake tech company was scheduled to begin in exactly 24 hours. I brought up a secondary tracking window analyzing Nolan's recent digital activity on the dark web. He was cornered by the IRS property seizure, but he still had access to the stolen $15 million currently resting in Sienna's corporate accounts. I cross-referenced that capital with his internet search history, and a chilling picture emerged. Nolan was not planning to stay and fight. He was planning to run. I opened a flight manifesto I had intercepted from a private aviation broker. Nolan had secured a stealth charter jet scheduled to depart a private airstrip at 2 o'clock in the morning immediately following the gala. The flight path was charted directly to a sovereign territory holding absolutely no extradition treaty with the United States. He is using the gala as a final harvest, I explained, tracing the flight route on the monitor. He invited dozens of high-net-worth investors to the launch party. He intends to use the fabricated hype to secure massive on-the-spot seed capital deposits. He will combine those fresh deposits with the stolen $15 million, abandon his entire life here, and vanish into a non-extradition zone with Sienna before the financial markets open on Monday morning. By the time his elderly clients realize their life savings are gone, he will be untouchable. Jada checked the heavy silver watch on her wrist. The tension in the room thickened, pulling the air tight. The clock was aggressively ticking down. If Nolan boarded that plane, the stolen $15 million would evaporate forever, and the elderly victims would be left completely destitute. The federal agencies needed to act with unprecedented speed to freeze the corporate accounts and physically intercept him. Jada had pulled every favor and leveraged every high-level connection she possessed within the Justice Department to push the dossier to the top of the priority queue, but federal bureaucracy was notoriously sluggish. We sat in the sterile conference room listening to the low hum of the servers. Every passing minute felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. I had dismantled his domestic life, but if he escaped with the capital, he would still win. We needed the federal hammer to drop before the gala concluded. A sharp, customized chime suddenly pierced the silence of the room. Jada's secure laptop illuminated with a high-priority notification. She quickly entered her biometric passcode and opened the encrypted email. I watched her eyes track back and forth across the text, reading the brief message twice to ensure she had not misread the contents. She slowly closed the laptop and turned to face me. The clinical professional mask vanished, entirely replaced by a fierce, predatory smile that reached her eyes. "The feds just approved the warrant," Jada stated, her voice practically humming with electric anticipation. "Get dressed. We have a party to crash." I did not hesitate. The time for hiding in safe houses and operating from the shadows was officially over. I stood up from the conference table, the lingering ache in my fractured ribs entirely muted by the sheer rush of absolute certainty. We left Jada's office and took the private elevator down to a luxury suite she maintained in the adjacent tower. It was time to shed the final physical remnants of my victimhood and prepare for the execution. In the sterile, brightly lit bathroom of the suite, I carefully peeled away the bulky medical bandages taped across my torso. The bruising had faded into a dull yellowish purple, a mapped history of Nolan's brutality that I no longer needed to hide behind soft fabrics and oversized sweaters. I washed away the exhaustion of the past weeks and sat before the vanity mirror. I applied my makeup with the clinical precision of a surgeon. A sharp contour, a bold crimson lip, and hair pulled back into a severe, flawless twist. I actively erased the meek, accommodating housewife Nolan had spent a decade molding into submission. The woman staring back at me in the glass was a complete stranger to him. She was an architect of ruin. Jada had ordered a selection of wardrobe options, but I knew exactly what I needed. I bypassed the elegant evening gowns and selected a tailored, razor-sharp tuxedo suit in deep midnight blue. The fabric was heavy and unforgiving, cut with aggressive geometric lines that squared my shoulders and elongated my frame. The silk lapels caught the light like polished steel. I slipped into a pair of sleek, pointed stiletto heels. It was not a celebratory outfit. It was armor crafted specifically for the final battle. I adjusted the cuffs of my suit jacket, feeling a profound, terrifying calm settle deep into my marrow. Jada emerged from the living area wearing a striking emerald sheath dress, tapping a pair of thick, glossy VIP access lanyards against her palm. She tossed one to me. I caught it seamlessly, clipping the thick black ribbon around my neck. The credentials bore the fake startup's metallic logo. "Let us go collect our dividends," Jada said, holding the heavy suite door open. We descended to the subterranean parking garage where a black SUV was idling with the engine running. The rear doors opened simultaneously as we approached. Two men in impeccably tailored tuxedos sat in the back seats. They possessed the distinct rigid posture and hyper-observant gaze of men who carried concealed firearms. Jada offered brief introductions. They were senior undercover agents from the FBI's white-collar crime division, hand-picked to execute the federal warrant silently and ensure no one slipped out the back doors. They acknowledged me with brief, professional nods. We slid into the vehicle and the driver immediately accelerated toward the financial district. The launch gala was being held in the grand ballroom of the city's most exclusive five-star hotel. As our SUV pulled into the circular driveway, the sheer scale of Nolan's desperate delusion became glaringly obvious. A massive red carpet spilled out onto the cobblestone, flanked by thick velvet ropes and aggressive paparazzi snapping rapid-fire photos. Valets were sprinting across the pavement to park a steady stream of imported luxury vehicles. Nolan had spared absolutely no expense, clearly burning through the last remaining drops of the stolen $15 million to construct this opulent, blinding facade. We bypassed the chaotic main entrance entirely. Jada guided our four-person unit through a discreet side lobby reserved for high-level dignitaries and VIP guests. The two federal agents moved seamlessly ahead of us, their earpieces practically invisible, clearing the path with quiet authority. We encountered a heavy security checkpoint at the ballroom threshold, manned by thick-necked, private muscle-clutching digital tablets. Jada simply held up our VIP credentials. The guards unhooked the velvet ropes without a single question, granting us total unfettered access to the belly of the beast. The atmosphere inside the main ballroom was a suffocating cocktail of manufactured hype and predatory greed. Massive crystal chandeliers bathed the room in warm golden light. Waitstaff in crisp white uniforms circulated through the dense crowd, carrying silver trays loaded with vintage champagne and beluga caviar. The room was packed shoulder to shoulder, with the city's wealthiest elites, venture capitalists, and hedge fund managers, all eager to sink their money into the next billion-dollar tech unicorn. Electronic dance music pulsed from hidden speakers, vibrating heavily through the soles of my shoes. I scanned the crowded floor and immediately located my targets. Nolan and Sienna were holding court near the center stage, directly beneath a massive digital screen displaying their fabricated company's logo. They were playing the ultimate power couple with nauseating perfection. Nolan wore a custom velvet dinner jacket holding a rocks glass, his teeth flashing in a practiced, charming smile as he schmoozed a circle of potential investors. He was actively pitching the vaporware, spinning invisible code into absolute gold. Sienna stood clinging to his arm, dripping in diamond tennis bracelets that had undoubtedly been purchased with the liquidated life savings of defrauded retirees. She wore a backless silver gown, tossing her head and laughing loudly at a joke someone made. She was enthusiastically playing the role of the visionary tech CEO, soaking up the admiration of the room, completely oblivious to the fact that her entire reality was built on a ticking federal bomb. I did not wait in the shadows. I did not hide near the elaborate buffet tables to observe. I adjusted the lapels of my midnight blue suit, squared my shoulders, and stepped directly into the main ballroom. Jada and the two federal agents fanned out slightly behind me, creating a distinct aggressive wedge formation. I walked forward with a measured, deliberate stride. My stilettos clicked sharply against the polished marble floor. The sheer, radiating intensity of my presence acted as a physical force. The conversations nearest to me faltered and quickly died out. The sea of wealthy, arrogant elites naturally parted, stepping aside in confusion to clear a direct path for my approach. The sudden shift in the room's energy rippled forward like a wave. The low hum of networking vanished, replaced by an expanding, heavy silence. The parting crowd created a straight, unobstructed visual tunnel directly to the center stage. Nolan was mid-sentence, raising his glass to toast a wealthy venture capitalist. He caught the unnatural silence sweeping across the floor and turned his head. His eyes tracked down the cleared pathway and locked onto mine. The charismatic, arrogant smile slid off his face like wet clay. The color drained from his cheeks in an instant. The heavy glass of bourbon slipped entirely from his fingers, shattering violently against the floor and splashing across his expensive leather shoes. Sienna turned at the sharp noise, an annoyed expression forming on her glossy lips, but it instantly morphed into gaping shock as she recognized me standing in the center of her kingdom. I did not break my stride. I marched straight toward the stage, keeping my eyes locked on Nolan as the last remnants of his arrogance shattered into pure, unadulterated terror. Nolan's panic lasted only a fraction of a second before his primal survival instinct kicked in. His face flushed a dark, angry crimson, the veins in his neck bulging against his stiff collar. He frantically waved his hand in a sharp chopping motion toward the perimeter of the room, silently signaling the heavy-set private security detail flanking the stage. 4 massive men wearing dark suits and coiled earpieces immediately detached from the shadows. They began converging on my position with frightening speed, their large hands reaching out to physically intercept me and drag me from the ballroom. Before their thick fingers could even brush the fabric of my tuxedo suit, Jada materialized at my right shoulder. She did not raise her voice, but her tones sliced through the ambient noise of the gala like a surgical blade. She thrust a sleek leather wallet directly into the broad chest of the lead guard, flipping it open to reveal her heavy brass legal credentials. She informed them in a cold, deadly whisper that if they laid a single hand on either of us, they would not only be facing immediate federal assault charges, but she would personally file a catastrophic multi-million-dollar corporate discrimination lawsuit against the hotel, the security firm, and the event organizers before the clock struck midnight. The guards froze in their tracks. They exchanged uncertain, panicked glances completely neutralized by the threat of professional and financial ruin. The lead guard swallowed hard, nodded sharply, and signaled his men to stand down. They stepped backward, clearing the final few yards to the stage and leaving Nolan entirely exposed. The disruption had not gone unnoticed by the night's other key player. Patricia surged forward from the VIP seating area, moving with a surprising, frantic speed. Her signature pearls clicked violently against her collarbone as she aggressively positioned herself directly in my path, acting as a human shield for her son. Her carefully maintained aristocratic mask was entirely gone, replaced by the vicious, snarling face of a cornered animal. She leaned in close, the smell of expensive gin and sharp mint radiating from her breath. "You are ruining everything," she hissed, her voice vibrating with venomous desperation and unfiltered hatred. "You parasitic little nobody, get out of this room right now before I have you thrown into the street where you belong." She threw her hands forward, attempting to shove me backward by the shoulders to create a physical barrier and force my retreat. I did not flinch. I did not raise a hand to defend myself. I simply shifted my weight to the left and smoothly sidestepped her aggressive lunge. Bereft of her target, Patricia's forward momentum completely betrayed her. Her expensive stiletto caught the raised edge of a heavy velvet floor runner. She stumbled violently forward, her arms pinwheeling wildly in the air as she crashed awkwardly into a nearby high-top cocktail table. Crystal glasses clattered and ice spilled across the polished marble floor, drawing a fresh wave of gasps from the surrounding elite investors. I did not even look back to see if she had fallen. She was no longer a threat. She was just an obstacle I had effortlessly bypassed. Realizing that brute force and intimidation had entirely failed Nolan, and Sienna panicked. The desperate reality of their situation forced their hands. They realized the only way to salvage the evening and secure the desperately needed investor capital to fund their escape was to seize absolute control of the narrative. Nolan grabbed Sienna by the elbow, practically dragging her up the short flight of stairs onto the main stage. He snatched a wireless microphone from the acrylic podium, plastering a remarkably convincing, albeit sweaty, smile back onto his face. He loudly welcomed the crowd, projecting his voice over the murmurs and aggressively ignoring my presence as I took a seat in the dead center of the front row. Jada sat to my right, crossing her legs with utter composure, while the two undercover federal agents flanked us, their eyes constantly scanning the room for exits. Sienna stepped up to her microphone, her chest heaving as she tried to project the image of a visionary tech CEO. She began her rehearsed pitch, gesturing wildly toward the massive digital screen illuminated behind them. She spoke rapidly, her voice artificially bright, as she talked about revolutionary algorithms, decentralized finance, and entirely disrupting the global tech market. She rattled off meaningless Silicon Valley buzzwords, promising impossible returns on investment and absolute market domination. Nolan chimed in, pacing the stage like a seasoned evangelist, hyping the artificial intelligence integration that supposedly formed the backbone of their new platform. He practically begged the venture capitalists in the room to open their checkbooks and secure their exclusive early access seed shares tonight. They were selling a ghost-wrapping federal wire fraud and stolen retiree funds in a shiny high-tech bow. They were begging for the very cash they needed to fuel their chartered jet to a non-extradition zone. I let them speak for exactly 3 minutes. I let them build the hype, feeding the bottomless greed of the room, until the wealthy investors were leaning forward in their seats, completely captivated by the grand illusion. I watched Nolan sweat under the stage lights, desperate to close the trap on his audience before my presence unraveled his lies. Then I reached slowly into the right pocket of my midnight blue tuxedo jacket. My fingers wrapped around the cool, smooth plastic of a small remote clicker. Jada had not just spent the afternoon drafting legal affidavits and coordinating with federal agencies. She had also paid a highly lucrative, untraceable cash visit to the hotel's primary audiovisual technician exactly 2 hours before the gala began. We owned the central control booth. I pulled the clicker from my pocket, resting my hand casually on my knee where Nolan could clearly see it. Nolan was mid-pitch, his voice reaching a frantic crescendo as he directed the audience's attention to the massive screen for the highly anticipated financial projections. I caught his eye, offered a razor-thin, uncompromising smile, and pressed the single red button. Instantly, the vibrant, high-definition presentation slides vanished. The massive LED screen directly behind Nolan and Sienna went completely violently pitch black, plunging their entire fabricated empire into darkness. A heavy collective gasp rippled across the grand ballroom as the massive digital display died. The sudden absence of the glaring artificial light plunged the center stage into a disorienting gloom. A low murmur of confusion immediately swept through the crowd of venture capitalists and hedge fund managers. They exchanged bewildered glances, lowering their champagne flutes. On stage, Nolan tapped the metal grate of his wireless microphone. A dull thud echoed through the speakers, but his slick presentation remained entirely absent. He looked over his shoulder at the black void, desperately waving his free hand toward the hidden audiovisual booth, positioned in the upper balcony. He forced a strained chuckle, attempting to pass the catastrophic failure off as a minor technical glitch. I did not give him the opportunity to recover. I stood up from my seat in the front row, the movement sharp and deliberate. The soft velvet of the chair released me, and I stepped into the center aisle. Jada remained seated, her arms casually crossed, watching my ascent with quiet satisfaction. The two undercover federal agents shifted slightly, securing the perimeter and ensuring no one interfered with my path. I walked toward the side of the stage, my stilettos clicking rhythmically against the polished wooden steps. Every eye in the ballroom gravitated toward the sound. The murmurs died away, replaced by a thick, expectant silence. I stepped fully into the glare of the stage spotlights. The heavy fabric of my midnight blue tuxedo suit absorbed the heat. I did not look at Nolan as I moved past him. I could smell the sharp tang of his nervous sweat cutting through his expensive cologne. He was entirely frozen, paralyzed by a primal fear he could not articulate. I walked directly to the secondary acrylic podium where a spare microphone rested on a weighted stand. I wrapped my fingers around the cool metal of the microphone, lifting it smoothly from its cradle. I turned to face the sea of wealthy elites. Their faces were painted with wealthy curiosity, anticipating some planned theatrical twist to the tech launch. I raised the remote clicker in my left hand and pressed the central button one more time. The massive LED screen behind me roared back to life with blinding intensity. It did not display the sleek minimalist logo of Sienna's fake tech company. Instead, it illuminated the ballroom with the harsh, glaring reality of my forensic spreadsheets. Gigantic rows of raw financial data flooded the screen. I had formatted the graphics perfectly for maximum visual impact. Thick red lines traced stolen assets from local banking institutions, while bright green arrows routed the capital through a complex web of Cayman Island shell corporations. The exact account numbers, routing codes, and wire transfer timestamps were magnified for everyone in the room to read clearly. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to a $15 million Ponzi scheme. I announced, my voice projecting through the immaculate sound system with absolute icy clarity. The silence in the room fractured instantly. A shockwave of genuine alarm rolled through the audience as the wealthy investors squinted at the massive display, trying to comprehend the dense financial mapping looming above my head. I paced slowly across the front of the stage, gesturing toward the screen. The revolutionary tech platform you were just pitched tonight does not exist. I continued, my tone devoid of emotion. There is no proprietary algorithm. There is no engineering team. The company hosting this lavish event is nothing but a hollow domestic money laundering vehicle. The man standing on this stage has spent the last 3 years
systematically liquidating the low-risk trust funds and municipal bonds of elderly retirees. He stole exactly $15 million from the most vulnerable clients in his portfolio.
The temperature in the ballroom seemed to drop 10 degrees. The clinking of glasses ceased entirely. I raised the clicker and advanced the slide. The screen shifted to display the fraudulent quarterly performance statements Nolan had fabricated side by side with the actual depleted bank records. The math was undeniably devastating. "The money you are investing tonight is not funding innovation," I stated, looking directly into the crowd of terrified billionaires. "Your seed capital is covering the funds Nolan stole from his firm's pension accounts. He invited you here to harvest your deposits so he can backfill the massive hole he dug before the federal government audits his books. You are not venture capitalists tonight. You are his getaway fund." Absolute mayhem erupted. The polite composure of the wealthy crowd shattered into sheer visceral panic. Men in tailored suits began shouting over one another, pulling out their smartphones with frantic urgency. They were dialing their personal bankers, dialing their lawyers, dialing anyone who could immediately freeze the wire transfers they had authorized earlier in the evening, the air filled with the chaotic sounds of wealth desperately trying to protect itself. Nolan snapped out of his paralyzed stupor, his face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. "Cut the microphone," he screamed, lunging toward the edge of the stage and waving his arms frantically at the upper balcony. "Cut the audio right now. Turn off that screen. Security, get her off this stage." He shouted until his vocal cords frayed, but the audio did not cut out. The massive spreadsheets remained glowing brightly against the back wall. Jada's generous cash bribe to the audiovisual technician guaranteed that the control booth was entirely locked down. The private security guards standing around the perimeter of the room remained rooted to the floor, explicitly neutralized by Jada's earlier legal threats and the presence of the federal agents. Nolan was completely powerless, a puppet whose strings had just been violently severed. He spun around wildly looking for an escape route, but the exits were clogged with panicking investors. Sienna could not handle the collapse of her stolen kingdom. The delusion she had carefully constructed over the past 6 months was disintegrating on live television. She gripped her own wireless microphone, her knuckles turning white as she marched toward the center of the stage. Her silver gown shimmered under the lights, but her face was twisted into a grotesque mask of desperation. "She is lying!" Sienna yelled into her microphone, her voice shrill and echoing harshly over the panicked crowd. "Do not listen to a word she says. Look at her. She is just a jealous, crazy ex-wife trying to ruin our success. She is a dropout. She knows nothing about finance or tech. This is a targeted harassment campaign. We are legitimate. We are going to change the world." Her voice cracked on the final word, echoing pitifully against the overwhelming visual evidence looming directly behind her head. The investors were not listening to her frantic denials. They were staring at the irrefutable data scrolling across the screen. I stopped pacing and turned to face her. I did not raise my voice or offer a rebuttal to her pathetic personal attacks. I simply offered her a cold, clinical smile that held absolutely no warmth. I lifted the remote clicker toward the screen and pressed the button one final time. The massive LED screen behind me did not stay dark for long. It flickered a sharp static buzz, crackling through the ballroom's state-of-the-art surround sound system before illuminating with a stark, entirely different visual. The complex spreadsheets and routing numbers were gone. In their place, crystal-clear, high-definition video footage filled the colossal display. It was a dual-angle dashboard camera recording. The harsh white timestamp glowing in the bottom corner anchored the exact date and time of the crash. The ambient noise in the ballroom dropped to absolute zero. Even the clanking of crystal glasses ceased entirely. Hundreds of the city's most ruthless financial predators held their collective breath, captivated by the raw, undeniable reality playing out above them. The screen was split. The left side displayed the exterior view of a rain-slicked highway, the headlights cutting through the darkness just seconds before the impact. The right side displayed the interior cabin camera. It showed Nolan behind the wheel, his hands casually draped over the leather steering wheel. It showed Sienna sitting in the passenger seat completely oblivious. And it showed me sitting quietly in the back, directly behind the driver's seat. The ballroom watched in dead, suffocating silence as the sudden hazard materialized on the dark road. They watched the interior camera capture the exact split-second calculation in Nolan's eyes. It was not a panicked, uncontrollable reaction. It was a conscious, deliberate choice. The audience watched in high definition as Nolan violently jerked the steering wheel to the right. He intentionally angled the heavy vehicle, throwing the rear driver's side directly into the path of the oncoming concrete barrier. He deliberately created a human shield out of my body to absorb the catastrophic impact and completely protect the passenger side where Sienna sat. The screech of locking tires and the horrific deafening crunch of shattering glass and buckling steel echoed through the ballroom speakers. Several women in the front rows physically recoiled, raising their hands to their mouths in sheer horror. The visual of the mangled smoking wreckage remained frozen on the massive screen, a monument to Nolan's ultimate betrayal. But the presentation was not over. A new audio file began to play over the frozen image of the crushed vehicle. It was a clean digital recording secured by Jada's relentless subpoenas of the emergency responder body cameras and hospital trauma bay logs. The audio was raw and frantic. The chaotic noise of the emergency room, the aggressive beeping of trauma monitors, the frantic overlapping voices of nurses and paramedics shouting out my plummeting vital signs. Then cutting through the medical chaos like a rusted blade, Nolan's voice rang out. It echoed across the grand ballroom with chilling, undeniable clarity. "Save Sienna first," he shouted on the recording, his voice lacking even a fraction of concern for his bleeding wife. "Cassidy can wait." The sheer sociopathic depravity of those words hung suspended in the golden light of the ballroom. The financial fraud had sparked anger, but this calculated, callous disregard for a human life crossed a moral boundary that even the most cutthroat venture capitalists could not stomach. The dead silence violently shattered. A collective visceral gasp of revulsion gave way to an immediate and deafening uproar. Disgust rippled through the crowd like a physical shockwave. The men and women who, moments ago, had been practically begging to hand Nolan their money now stared at him with unabashed horror. Shouts of outrage erupted from the floor. Investors began screaming aggressively, demanding their seed capital be returned instantly. Men in tailored suits raised their phones, furiously yelling at their bank managers to reverse the wire transfers they had authorized earlier in the evening. The aura of the visionary tech genius evaporated entirely, leaving only a monster exposed under the harsh stage lights. Down in the VIP section, the crushing weight of reality finally broke Patricia. She stood staring up at the frozen image of the crash, the echo of her son's monstrous command ringing in her ears. The aristocratic arrogance, the carefully curated social superiority she had wielded like a weapon, her entire life drained entirely from her face. She realized with terrifying clarity that she had relentlessly defended and enabled a sociopath. She grasped blindly at the edge of the cocktail table, her manicured fingers trembling violently. Her knees simply buckled beneath her. Patricia collapsed heavily into a velvet chair, her posture completely crumbling. The wealthy elites she had spent decades trying to impress were now backing away from her, staring at her with a mixture of unabashed horror and pathetic pity. Her social standing, her pristine family legacy, her entire curated world was reduced to radioactive ash in a matter of seconds. She was instantly a pariah ruined beyond repair. On stage, Sienna covered her mouth with trembling hands. The glossy facade of the tech CEO was gone. She was just a terrified girl caught in the blast radius of her own greed, suddenly realizing the true nature of the man she had conspired with. She stumbled backward, tripping over the hem of her silver gown, desperately trying to put physical distance between herself and Nolan, as if his proximity was a disease. Nolan stood frozen at the center of the stage, his chest heaving. He looked at the furious, screaming crowd. He looked at the massive screen displaying his ultimate sin. He looked at the two federal agents who were now moving methodically up the side stairs to secure the perimeter. The invisible walls of his trap snapped completely shut. He had no money, no leverage, no investors, and no escape route to a non-extradition zone. The stealth charter jet waiting on the tarmac would be leaving empty. His life, his freedom, and his power were completely and utterly over. The absolute finality of his destruction broke whatever rational restraints Nolan had left. The charismatic, calculating facade burned away entirely, leaving only pure, volatile, animalistic rage. His eyes locked onto me. I stood perfectly still on the side of the stage in my midnight blue armor, the remote clicker still resting casually in my hand. His face twisted into a grotesque mask of pure, unfiltered hatred. A guttural, unhinged roar tore from his throat, stripping away the last remnants of his humanity. Abandoning all pretense of sanity, Nolan lowered his head, clenched his fists, and violently lunged across the stage, hurtling his entire body directly toward me. The heavy air of the ballroom shattered as Nolan crossed the short distance between us. He was a blur of dark velvet and blind rage, his face contorted into something entirely unrecognizable. I did not flinch. I did not retreat a single inch. I stood perfectly still, watching the man who had spent 10 years attempting to bury me now rushing headlong toward his own self-constructed grave. He never made contact. Before his outstretched hands could even brush the silk lapel of my midnight blue suit, Jada moved. She did not merely intercept him. She dismantled his forward momentum with terrifying, calculated precision. Stepping fluidly into his direct path, she hooked her forearm sharply under his leading elbow, pivoted her hips, and used his own reckless velocity entirely against him. With a sudden, violent twist, she wrenched his arm high up between his shoulder blades. Nolan let out a strangled, breathless shriek as his knees slammed brutally into the polished floorboards of the stage. Jada drove her knee into the small of his back, pinning him to the ground with the effortless, unyielding grace of a seasoned predator taking down a wounded, frantic animal. At that exact second, the massive double doors at the rear of the grand ballroom burst open with the concussive force of a detonated explosive. The heavy oak panels slammed against the walls, echoing like a gunshot over the terrified, rising screams of the venture capitalists. A synchronized tide of federal authority flooded into the opulent room. Dozens of agents wearing dark tactical windbreakers emblazoned with the bright yellow letters of the FBI and the SEC swarmed the floor. They moved with absolute, uncompromising efficiency, slicing through the panicked crowd of billionaires and hedge fund managers. The wealthy elite, accustomed to a lifetime of untouchable privilege and quiet discretion, scrambled backward. They pressed their expensive tailored suits and designer silk gowns against the walls, desperately trying to escape the blast radius of the raid. Glasses shattered as cocktail tables were overturned in the chaotic stampede. The lead federal agent, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a face carved from granite, marched straight down the center aisle. He did not spare a single glance for the terrified investors cowering around him. He ascended the stage stairs in 3 quick, heavy strides, pulling a solid gold shield from his jacket pocket. He stopped directly over Nolan, who was still pinned flat against the floorboards by Jada's iron grip. The agent crouched down, flashing the badge mere inches from Nolan's sweating, panicked face. "Nolan, you are under arrest for federal wire fraud, embezzlement, and attempted manslaughter," the agent stated, his voice booming with the undeniable, crushing weight of the United States government. Jada stepped back, smoothing an invisible wrinkle from her emerald dress, and allowed the federal agents to take over. 2 large officers hauled Nolan up from the floor by his armpits. He was completely limp, his legs stubbornly refusing to support his own weight. The sharp, unmistakable ratcheting click of heavy steel handcuffs locking securely around his wrists echoed through the microphone that still lay discarded near his feet. The absolute reality of his destruction finally penetrated his deep-seated delusion. The feral rage that had fueled his charge evaporated instantly, replaced by a pathetic, desperate whimper. He looked down at the cold metal biting into his skin, his chest heaving with rapid, shallow breaths. As the agents turned him around to face the crowd of investors he had spent the entire evening attempting to defraud, Nolan completely unraveled. He began to thrash weakly against the grip of the federal agents, his designer shoes scuffing against the stage. "This is a mistake," he screamed, his voice cracking into a high hysterical pitch that echoed through the cavernous room. "It is a terrible misunderstanding. You have the wrong man. I am a legitimate businessman. I have lawyers. You cannot do this to me." The agents ignored his frantic, useless protests, dragging him toward the edge of the stage. Realizing the authorities were entirely deaf to his lies, Nolan whipped his head around. His wild, bloodshot eyes locked onto mine. The arrogance, the control, the sociopathic superiority he had lorded over me for a decade were entirely gone. He was nothing but a hollow, terrified shell facing the absolute end of his existence. "Cassidy, please!" He begged, his voice dropping into a wet, guttural sob. "Please stop this. Tell them it is a lie. I will give it all back. Every single cent, I promise. Just call them off, Cassidy. Please do not let them take me. I am your husband." I looked down at him from my position on the stage. I did not offer a smile, a frown, or a single word of vindication. I offered him absolutely nothing but a cold, indifferent stare. I watched in total silence as the federal agents dragged him down the stairs and paraded him through the center of the ballroom. The flashbulbs of the paparazzi who had slipped in through the breached doors behind the tactical team erupted in a blinding strobe effect, immortalizing his humiliated, weeping face for the front page of every financial publication in the world. While the room remained entirely captivated by Nolan's pathetic, highly public walk of shame, my eyes scanned the vacant space on the stage. Sienna was missing. The moment the heavy ballroom doors had burst open and the tactical raid commenced, the fake tech CEO had recognized the immediate collapse of her stolen empire. While Nolan was busy throwing his life away in a fit of misplaced rage, Sienna had engaged in pure calculated self-preservation. She had slipped silently backward, ducking behind the heavy velvet curtains that masked the rear of the stage. She navigated the dark, narrow service corridors running behind the ballroom walls. The pulsing electronic music and the screams of the investors were muffled here, replaced by the frantic, echoing clicks of her own silver heels against the bare concrete. She was clutching a massive limited-edition designer handbag tightly to her chest. It was bulging at the seams, hastily stuffed with whatever loose cash bearer bonds and untraceable jewelry she had managed to snatch from the hotel suite safe before fleeing. Her breath came in ragged, terrified gasps as she hiked up the skirt of her silver gown. She pushed through the dimly lit labyrinth, blindly following the glowing red exit signs leading toward the loading dock. She believed she had successfully navigated the crossfire. She believed she was slipping quietly out the back door, leaving Nolan to absorb the entirety of the federal hammer while she vanished into the night with the remaining spoils. She reached the heavy metal fire door at the end of the corridor. She threw her shoulder against the push bar, bursting out into the cool, damp air of the service alley. A triumphant, breathless smile began to form on her lips. The smile died instantly. Standing directly in the center of the narrow concrete alleyway, illuminated by the harsh, unforgiving glare of a single security spotlight, was Jada. She had anticipated the escape route perfectly. Jada stood with her arms crossed, exuding a lethal, uncompromising authority. Flanking her on either side were two stone-faced federal agents, their hands resting casually on their tactical belts, completely blocking the only exit. Sienna froze, her grip tightening desperately on her stolen designer bag as the reality of her entrapment closed in around her. The heavy metal fire door clicked shut behind Sienna, sealing her fate in the damp concrete alley. The two federal agents stepped forward, their heavy flashlights cutting through the darkness to pin her against the wet brick wall. Sienna's eyes darted frantically, searching for a non-existent gap in their tactical formation. When she realized physical escape was completely impossible, her survival instincts executed a flawless, instantaneous pivot. The arrogant, untouchable tech CEO persona vanished in a fraction of a second. She dropped the bulging designer handbag onto the rough asphalt. The golden clasp burst open upon impact, spilling thick stacks of $100 bills and glittering diamond bracelets directly at the agent's tactical boots. Sienna collapsed against the brickwork, allowing her knees to buckle just enough to appear fragile. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with violent theatrical sobs. You have to listen to me, Sienna cried, her voice trembling with manufactured terror. She peered through her fingers, aiming her wide, tear-filled eyes at the taller of the two male agents. I had absolutely no idea. Nolan lied to me. He manipulated me from the very beginning. I am just a consultant. I am just a young girl. He used to be the beautiful face of his company. I swear to you on my life, I did not know the money was stolen. He controlled everything. He made all the financial decisions. I was terrified of him. She reached a trembling hand out toward the agent, playing the helpless victim caught in a powerful man's dangerous web. He forced me to go along with it. Please, you have to believe me. I am a victim here too. The federal agents did not soften. They did not lower their flashlights. They did not even blink. Jada stepped out from the shadows, her stilettos clicking sharply against the wet pavement. She looked down at the spilled cash and jewelry, then back up to Sienna's tear-stained face. Jada's expression was a mask of absolute terrifying amusement. She did not offer handcuffs right away. Instead, she raised her left arm, revealing a thick, heavy leather binder she had tucked tightly against her side. That is a truly spectacular performance, Sienna, Jada said, her voice dripping with lethal sarcasm. It really is. You almost have me convinced that you are just a naive, innocent bystander swept up in a bad romance. Jada stopped mere inches from Sienna. She unclasped the heavy binder and flipped it open, holding it up so the harsh security spotlight illuminated the dense legal text and the glaring notarized signatures at the bottom of the pages. There is just one tiny, insurmountable problem with your victim narrative, Jada continued, tapping a manicured fingernail against the documents. Actually, Sienna Nolan did not make you a partner in this little venture. He did not make you a minority shareholder. According to the original incorporation documents filed in Delaware, Nolan made you the sole signatory and the 100% equity owner of the LLC. Sienna's fake sobbing hitched in her throat. Her hands slowly lowered from her face as the devastating words registered. That is right, Jada smiled, snapping the binder shut with a sound like a gunshot. Nolan kept his name entirely off the official ownership registry. You are not his employee. Legally speaking, you are the absolute mastermind. You are personally liable for the $15 million debt owed to those pensioners. You are personally liable for the corporate wire fraud. And most impressively, you personally signed the fraudulent federal tax documents and the fabricated SEC disclosures. Sienna stared at the heavy leather binder, her eyes wide with genuine, unadulterated horror. The blood drained completely from her face, leaving her pale and trembling uncontrollably. The missing pieces of the puzzle aggressively snapped into place inside her mind. All those documents Nolan had rushed her to sign while they were drinking expensive champagne. All the times he told her it was just standard founder paperwork to establish her as the visionary CEO. He had never intended to share the kingdom with her. He had meticulously constructed a glass cliff positioning her at the very edge. Nolan had set her up as the ultimate fall guy just in case his massive Ponzi scheme ever went wrong. He had built her up solely to absorb the devastating legal impact of his inevitable crash. The realization hit her with the destructive force of a freight train. The glamorous delusion shattered permanently. No, Sienna whispered, backing away until her spine scraped painfully against the cold brick. No, he would not do that to me. He loves me. He loves an expendable asset, Jada corrected coldly. She nodded to the waiting officers. Take the CEO away. The agents moved in, grabbing Sienna by the arms and spinning her around roughly. The harsh snap of metal handcuffs locking securely over her wrists broke her paralysis. A sound tore from Sienna's throat, a raw, guttural scream of absolute despair. It was not a fake cry for sympathy. It was the agonizing wail of a woman realizing her entire life was over. She thrashed wildly against the agents, kicking at the spilled cash on the ground. Nolan, she shrieked, her voice echoing violently down the concrete alleyway and carrying all the way back into the hotel's rear corridors. You set me up. You ruined me. The agents dragged her forcefully out of the alley and into the service entrance. Her desperate screams reverberated against the marble walls as they marched her toward the main lobby for federal processing. I had already descended from the stage, walking briskly through the grand lobby of the hotel as the tactical teams finished securing the ballroom. The air was thick with the chaotic energy of the raid. Flashing red and blue lights from the police cruisers outside painted the opulent glass doors. I buttoned my tuxedo jacket, ready to leave the wreckage of my past behind me forever. Before I could reach the revolving doors, a frantic blur of movement caught my peripheral vision. Patricia burst through the crowd of shell-shocked investors and bewildered hotel staff. Her expensive updo was completely unraveled strands of hair plastered to her sweating face. Her flawless makeup was ruined, streaked with dark, jagged lines of mascara. The arrogant matriarch, who had spent a decade treating me like dirt on the bottom of her shoe, was entirely gone. She sprinted directly into my path. I stopped watching her approach with clinical detachment. Patricia did not just stop in front of me, she physically collapsed. Her knees slammed heavily onto the polished marble floor of the lobby. She reached out her trembling hands, grasping desperately at the fabric of my trousers. She looked up at me, her face contorted in sheer pathetic agony. "Cassidy, please!" Patricia begged, her voice cracking into a hoarse, desperate wail. The wealthy elite standing nearby turned to stare in absolute shock at the sight of the city's most formidable socialite groveling on the floor. "Please, I am begging you," Patricia cried, her fingers digging tighter into my suit. "You have the money. You have the proof. You can fix this. You can hire the best lawyers. You can pay back the investors. You can bail him out." Her heavy scent of expensive perfume was sour with panic sweat. She had lost all sense of dignity, driven entirely by the primal terror of losing her son to the federal penitentiary. "We are family!" Patricia screamed, her voice echoing shrilly through the quieted lobby. "You cannot do this to us. You cannot let them take my boy." I looked down at the woman clawing frantically at the fabric of my trousers. Patricia's manicured nails snagged on the wool blend of my suit, her face completely stripped of the haughty aristocratic sneer she had worn for a decade. She was a broken, weeping mess on the lobby floor, begging me to rescue the son she had actively helped turn into a monster. I did not bend down to comfort her. I did not offer a shred of the empathy she was desperately demanding. I simply reached down and firmly pried her trembling fingers off my clothing. "We stopped being family the night you helped him plan my funeral," I stated, my voice echoing with absolute freezing finality. I stepped around her sobbing form, walked through the heavy revolving doors, and stepped out into the crisp, cool night air, leaving the chaotic wreckage of the gala entirely behind me. Exactly 1 month later, the heavy oak doors of the federal family courthouse swung open with a dull, resonant thud. The air inside the room was stale, carrying the faint, sterile scent of floor wax and old paper. I sat perfectly composed at the plaintiff's table, wearing a sharp, tailored charcoal suit. Jada sat to my right, her posture immaculate, casually arranging a towering stack of heavily tabbed legal binders. A harsh, metallic rattling sound echoed from the holding corridor just beyond the judge's bench. The side door opened and 2 armed federal marshals escorted Nolan into the stark, fluorescent-lit courtroom. The visual transformation was absolutely staggering. The bespoke Italian suits, the silk ties, and the arrogant, untouchable aura of the Silicon Valley visionary were completely gone. In their place was a glaring, oversized orange prison jumpsuit that hung loosely off his diminishing frame. Heavy steel shackles bound his wrists and ankles, connected by a thick chain that forced him to shuffle forward with small, pathetic steps. He looked severely gaunt, his cheekbones jutting out sharply against skin that had lost its expensive artificial tan, taking on the sickly, pallid gray of permanent indoor confinement. The arrogant, calculating spark in his eyes had been entirely extinguished. As he sank heavily into the wooden chair at the defendant's table, he looked like a hollowed-out, haunted shell of a human being. He stared blankly at the mahogany table, fully aware of the absolute devastation raging outside the walls of his concrete cell. Jada and her forensic team had spent the last 30 days ruthlessly dismantling every single pillar of his fraudulent life. The consequences had been swift and apocalyptic. Patricia was officially bankrupt. The federal government had moved with terrifying speed, seizing her sprawling historic estate, her offshore accounts, and every piece of jewelry she owned to cover the immediate restitution demands of the defrauded pensioners. The high society friends she had spent a lifetime cultivating had completely abandoned her the second the FBI raid hit the news. The former queen of the city's elite was now residing in a cheap, crumbling motel on the outskirts of the industrial district, surviving on instant noodles and whatever spare change she could hide from the bankruptcy auditors. Sienna was faring even worse. Denied bail by a federal judge who explicitly labeled her a massive flight risk, she was currently sitting in a cold holding facility. The delusion of her tech empire was gone, replaced by the terrifying reality of a 20-year sentence in a maximum security federal penitentiary. As the sole legal signatory of the fraudulent shell company Nolan had created, she was drowning under the weight of $15 million in stolen assets and federal tax evasion charges. Her silver gowns had been traded for standard-issue prison scrubs. The bailiff stepped back slightly, allowing a marginal sliver of privacy across the wide expanse of the courtroom table. Nolan lifted his head slowly. The heavy chains binding his wrists clinked loudly against the polished wood. He looked at me, a desperate feral hunger pooling in his sunken eyes. He did not ask for forgiveness. He bypassed apologies entirely and went straight to begging for his survival. His voice was a raspy, broken whisper frayed by weeks of screaming in a holding cell. He pleaded with me to speak to the federal judge presiding over his impending criminal sentencing. He begged me to draft a favorable character witness statement, a plea for judicial leniency, to shave even a few years off his upcoming decades behind bars. He promised me absolute obedience. He swore that the isolation and the terror of prison had instantly cured him of his greed and his arrogance. He leaned as far across the table as his shackles would allow, his breath hitching in his chest. He promised that if I just showed him a fraction of mercy, he would spend the rest of his miserable, ruined life making it up to me. He swore he would work every single day until he died to repay the debt and prove his eternal devotion to me. I let him speak. I sat perfectly still, letting him empty his soul into the sterile courtroom air. I listened to the pathetic, rhythmic rattle of his chains as he desperately tried to negotiate for his freedom with the woman he had actively tried to murder. When he finally ran out of breath, panting heavily across the table with wide, terrified eyes, I did not offer a single word of comfort. I reached out and touched the thick, legally binding document resting at the very top of Jada's organized stack. It was the final, non-negotiable divorce decree. I slid the heavy, crisp paper slowly across the polished mahogany surface, pushing it until it stopped right in front of his shackled, trembling hands. I had meticulously structured the settlement down to the last decimal point. The decree completely and permanently dissolved our marriage, severing my name from his forever. But far more importantly, it legally stripped him of every remaining cent he had ever hidden. It liquidated his secret accounts, his offshore safety nets, and his hidden crypto wallets. Simultaneously, it legally saddled him with the entirety of the crushing, insurmountable legal debt incurred by his fraudulent empire. It left him with absolutely nothing but millions of dollars in financial liabilities and a lifetime in a concrete box. Nolan stared down at the dotted line awaiting his signature. His hands were shaking so violently, the chains rattled against the table like a drum roll. I leaned forward, resting my forearms gracefully on the table, and looked him dead in his terrified, bloodshot eyes. "You signed my life away in that hospital," I said, my voice slicing through the silent courtroom with absolute razor-sharp clarity. "Today I am signing yours." The scratch of the ballpoint pen against the heavy parchment echoed through the cavernous room like a final, definitive judgment. Nolan's hand shook so violently that the signature was barely legible, a jagged, broken scrawl that perfectly mirrored the shattered remains of his life. He pushed the document back across the mahogany surface, his head hanging low between his hunched shoulders. He did not look up again. The bailiff stepped forward, retrieving the finalized divorce decree and handing it to the judge. The sharp bang of the wooden gavel sealed the absolute conclusion of the proceedings. I stood up from the plaintiff's table. I smoothed a non-existent wrinkle from the jacket of my tailored charcoal suit, picked up my leather briefcase, and turned my back on the defendant's table. I did not look at him. I did not pause to revel in the sight of his orange jumpsuit or the heavy steel chains securing him to the floor. He was already a ghost, an irrelevant stain on a past life that I was officially leaving behind. Jada fell into step beside me, her posture immaculate, radiating the cold, untouchable confidence of a predator that had successfully cornered and devoured its prey. We walked down the center aisle, our heels clicking in perfect rhythmic synchronization against the polished marble floor. We pushed through the heavy oak double doors, moving past the lingering reporters and court photographers, without offering a single comment or a backward glance. We stepped through the final glass threshold of the federal courthouse and emerged onto the wide concrete steps outside. I stopped for a moment, closing my eyes and breathing in the crisp, biting autumn wind. The air tasted sharp and incredibly clean. It tasted like absolute, unadulterated freedom. The suffocating weight of the past 3 years, the betrayals, the financial ruin, the near-fatal crash, and the relentless legal warfare evaporated entirely from my shoulders. I opened my eyes and looked at the bustling, anonymous energy of the city streets stretching out before me. A sleek black town car was idling at the curb. Jada and I climbed into the leather interior, the heavy doors shutting out the ambient noise of the traffic. We rode in comfortable, victorious silence through the heart of the financial district. The car pulled to a smooth stop outside a towering state-of-the-art high-rise constructed of gleaming steel and mirrored glass. It was the premier corporate address in the city, an architectural monument to power and wealth. I stepped out of the vehicle, offering a polite nod to the uniformed doorman, who immediately pulled open the heavy glass entrance. I walked across the expansive minimalist lobby, bypassing the main security desk, and stepped into the private express elevator reserved strictly for the executive penthouses. The doors slid shut, and the high-speed cabin launched upward, leaving the street level completely behind. When the metal doors parted on the 60th floor, they revealed a completely different world. It was a world I had built from the ashes of my own destruction. Stretching across the frosted glass wall behind the reception desk were the bold gold leaf letters of my new empire. We had launched an elite boutique forensic auditing firm. It was designed with one singular ruthless purpose: to hunt down corporate predators, expose high-level embezzlement, and dismantle complex financial fraud schemes for the largest international banks and venture capital groups in the world. The sprawling office buzzed with an atmosphere of controlled, lethal efficiency. Junior analysts moved with rapid purpose through the open concept floor plan, carrying thick files of encrypted financial data. The phones rang with a soft, persistent hum, fielding desperate calls from Fortune 500 boards seeking our proprietary expertise. We had become the most feared and highly sought-after financial investigators in the country. Jada stepped out of her corner office to greet me. She was no longer just the brilliant attorney who had navigated my divorce. She was officially my business partner and the chief legal counsel of our skyrocketing firm. She wielded her legal authority like a broadsword, crushing corporate defense teams and securing ironclad settlements for our high-profile clients. We had transformed our shared trauma into a highly lucrative, impenetrable fortress of accountability. "We are completely booked for the next 3 years," Jada said, handing me a freshly printed profit and loss statement as we walked down the central corridor. "The European banking syndicate just agreed to our primary retainer terms. They are wiring the initial 7-figure deposit this afternoon." I smiled, reviewing the immaculate financial projections. "Perfect," I replied, handing the document back to her. "Let the analytics team know we are officially taking their portfolio." I approached the polished white marble reception desk, positioned outside the main executive boardroom. My receptionist, a sharp, impeccably dressed young man named David, stood up immediately. He handed me my morning espresso and a silver tray holding the day's sorted mail and executive briefings. "Everything is prepared for the 10 o'clock strategy session," David said smoothly. "But this arrived in the early delivery batch. I thought you should decide how to handle it." He gestured to a single isolated envelope resting on the very top of the silver tray. It was glaringly out of place among the crisp corporate stationery. The paper was cheap, rough, and slightly crumpled. Stamped violently across the top left corner in harsh black ink was the official seal of the United States Federal Penitentiary. I picked up the envelope, staring at the erratic, frantic handwriting scrawled across the front. It was from Nolan. I did not need to tear the cheap paper open to know exactly what the pages inside contained. I knew it was a desperate multi-page manifesto of absolute misery. I knew it was filled with pathetic, groveling, tear-stained apologies and wild, unhinged promises of a changed soul. It was the final desperate flailing of a broken man rotting in a concrete cell, begging for a sliver of attention from the woman who had orchestrated his complete demise. I held the envelope lightly between my index finger and thumb. I did not feel a single flicker of curiosity. I did not feel an ounce of pity, anger, or even lingering resentment. I felt absolutely nothing. Without breaking my stride, I walked over to the heavy-duty industrial paper shredder positioned near the administrative printing station. The machine was already humming with a low mechanical growl. I held Nolan's final desperate plea directly over the feeding slot. I opened my fingers and let the envelope slip from my grasp unopened. The steel blades instantly caught the cheap paper, violently grinding and tearing his apologies into thousands of meaningless, unreadable fragments. The sound of his destruction was brief and entirely satisfying. I turned my back on the shredder and pushed open the heavy mahogany double doors of my executive boardroom. The massive space was flooded with blinding, radiant natural sunlight, pouring in through the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the sprawling city skyline. My senior executive team was already assembled, standing at respectful attention around the long, polished conference table. Highly sensitive financial models and complex strategy documents were perfectly arranged at every seat, prepared for our next massive corporate takedown. I walked to the head of the table, the sunlight catching the sleek fabric of my suit. I looked at the brilliant, dedicated team I had handpicked, the thriving empire I had built with my own two hands, and the limitless, unwritten future stretching out before me. It was the ultimate ruthless victory. "Let us get to work," I said. The story of Cassidy's triumph teaches us a powerful lesson about resilience and closure. True healing does not require an apology from those who betrayed you. When Cassidy drops Nolan's unopened letter into the shredder, she proves that ultimate power lies in releasing the past and reclaiming your own narrative. We often waste precious years waiting for toxic people to finally acknowledge their wrongdoing, hoping it will bring us peace. Instead, genuine freedom begins when we redirect that energy into building our own empires. Stop waiting for their apologies and start constructing your own victorious future. What boundary will you set today to reclaim your power? Let me know in the comments below.